The Man Without Qualities. By Robert Musil. 114. Things are coming to a boil. Arnheim is gracious to General Stumm. Diotima prepares to move OFF into infinity. Ulrich daydreams about living one's life as one reads a book. His Grace had urged Diotima to find out about the famous Mackart pageant, which had brought all Austria together in the 1870s in a burst of national fervour. He still had vivid memories of the richly draped carriages, the heavily caparisoned horses, the trumpeters, and the pride people took in their medieval costumes, which lifted them out of their humdrum daily lives. It was this that had brought Diotima, Mime, and Ulrich to go through the materials on the period of the Imperial Library, from which they were now emerging together. As Diotima, her lip curling with disdain, had predicted to his Grace, what they had come up with was quite impossible. Such frippery could no longer make people forget the monotony of their existence. They were still on the library stairs when the beauty informed her companions that she felt like making the most of the sunny day and the year 1914, which in a few weeks of its existence had already left the mouldering past so far behind, by walking home. But they had no sooner stepped out into the light of day when they bumped into the General, on his way in. Proud to be discovered on a middle dot such a mission of high learning, he instantly offered to turn back and enlarge Diotima's entourage by joining it. This made Diotima realize after only a few steps that she was tired and wanted a cab. With no such vehicle in sight, they all stopped in front of the library, which faced a trough-shaped rectangular square, three sides of which were formed by splendid ancient facades, while on the fourth the asphalt street in front of a long, low palace shimmered like an ice rink, with cars and carriages rushing past, none of which responded to the four people waving and signaling to them like survivors of a shipwreck, until they tired of it and forgot about giving anything but the occasional half-hearted signal in the direction of the traffic. Arnheim had a big book under his arm. He was pleased with this gesture, both condescending and respectful toward the life of the mind. He greeted the General eagerly. "How nice to see you coming to the library too. Men of position nowadays so seldom seek out the life of the mind in its own house." General Stumm replied that he was quite at home in this library. Arnheim was impressed. "Almost all we have nowadays is writers, and hardly anyone who reads books anymore," he went on. "Do you realize, General, how many books are printed annually? I think it's over 100 books a day published till Germany alone. Over 1,000 periodicals are founded every year. The whole world is writing. Everyone helps himself to ideas as though they were his own, all the time. Nobody feels any responsibility toward the situation as a whole. Ever since the church lost its influence, there is no central authority to stem our general chaos. There is no educational model, no educational principle. In these circumstances it is only natural that feeling and morality should drift without an anchor, and the most stable person begins to waver." The General felt his mouth turning dry. It wasn't as though Dr. Arnheim was actually addressing him in person. He was a man standing in the square and thinking out loud. The General thought of how many people talk to themselves in the street, on their way to somewhere, civilians, of course, because a soldier who did such a thing would be locked up, and an officer would be sent to the psychiatric clinic. Stumm felt embarrassed at the thought of standing there philosophizing in public, as it were, smack dab in the middle of the imperial residential capital. Apart from the two men, there seemed to be only one other, a mute figure of bronze standing on a stone pedestal in the sunny square. The General had only just noticed this monument and did not remember whom it represented, so that he had to apologize for his ignorance when Arnheim asked him. "And to think that he was put here to be venerated," the great man remarked. "But that's how it is. Every moment of our lives we move among institutions, problems, and challenges of which we have barely caught the tail end, so that the present is constantly reaching into the past. We keep crashing through the floor, if I may put it so, into the cellars of time, even while we imagine ourselves to be occupying the top floor of the present." Mime smiled. He was making conversation. His moving lips flickered in the sunshine, and the lights in his eyes kept changing like those on a signaling steamer. Stumm was growing uneasy. He found it hard to keep acknowledging so many and such unusual turns in the conversation while being served up to the world, in full uniform, on this platter of a square. Grass was growing in the cracks between the cobblestones. It was last year's grass but looked implausibly fresh, like a corpse left lying in the snow. It was, in fact, most peculiar and disturbing that grass should be growing here between the stones, when only a few steps farther on the asphalt was being polished, in keeping with the times, by the passing cars. The General began to be troubled by a nervous fear that if he had to go on listening much longer he might suddenly go down on his knees and eat grass in front of the whole world, without knowing why. He looked around for Ulrich and Diotima for protection. These two had taken shelter where a thin veil of shade had spun itself around the corner of the wall, and seemed to be involved in an argument, though their voices were too low to be understood. "You make it sound hopeless," Diotima was saying. "What do you mean?" Ulrich asked, without real interest. "There is still such a thing as individuality." Ulrich tried to catch her eye sideways. "Good heavens, we've been all over this already. You have no heart, or you wouldn't always talk like this," she said softly. The sun-heated air was rising from the stone pavement up between her legs, which were encased in long skirts like those of a robed statue, inaccessible and to all intents non-existent. She showed no awareness of it. It was a caress that had nothing to do with anyone, any man. Her eyes turned pale. but that it might have been merely the effect of her reserve in a situation where she was exposed to the glances of the passers-by. Turning to Ulrich, she said with an effort, "When a woman has to choose between duty and passion, what can she rely on if not her character?" "You don't have to choose," Ulrich replied. "You go too far." "I wasn't speaking of myself," his cousin whispered. As he did not reply, they both stared across the square for a while in a hostile silence. Then Diotima asked, "Do you think that what we call our soul might emerge from the shadows where it usually keeps itself?" Ulrich gave her a puzzled look. "In the case of unusual, specially gifted persons," she added. Am I to understand that you're interested in establishing a rapport with the beyond?" Ulrich asked incredulously. "Has Amim introduced you to a medium?" Diotima was disappointed in him. "I would never have thought you capable of such a misunderstanding," she said reproachfully. "When I speak of emerging from the shadows, I mean from the unreality, from that flickering concealment in which we sometimes sense the presence of the unusual. It is spread out like a net that torments us because it will neither hold us nor let us go. Don't you think that there have been times when it was otherwise? When the inner life was a stronger presence, when there were individuals who walked in the light or, as people used to say, walked in holiness, and miracles could happen in reality because they are an ever-present form of another reality, and nothing else." Diotima surprised herself by the firmness with which it seemed possible to say this sort of thing, without any special elation, as though she were walking on solid ground. Ulrich felt secretly infuriated, but actually he was deeply shocked. Leas had come to this, he thought, that this giant hen can talk the way I do. Again he saw Diotima's soul in the shape of a colossal chicken pecking at his own soul, in the shape of a little worm. He was seized by the primal childhood terror of the giantess, mixed with another strange sensation. There was a certain gratification in before LG spiritually consumed, as it were, in mindless accord with a kinswoman. Their unanimity was a silly coincidence. Of course, he did not believe that there was any magic in being related by blood, nor could he possibly have taken his cousin seriously even if he were dead drunk. But he had been changing lately, mellowing perhaps. His characteristic inner readiness to move to the attack was giving way to a need for tenderness, dreams, kinship, whatever, which also manifested itself in sudden outbreaks of the ill will that was its opposite. Which prompted him to make fun of his cousin now. "If that's how you feel," he said, "then you ought to go all the way and become Arnheim's lover, openly or in secret, as soon as possible. You shouldn't say such things, I've given you no right." Diotima rebuked him. "But I must speak of it. Until now I wasn't sure what was going on between you and Arnheim. But now I understand, and you look to me like a person who is seriously thinking of flying to the moon. I would never have thought you capable of such madness. I've told you that I'm capable of going to extremes." Her upward gaze was meant to be audacious, but the sun made her screw up her eyes, so that she seemed to be twinkling at him. "These are their ravings of starved love," Ulrich said, "which pass off when hunger is appeased." He wondered what Arnheim's plans might be with regard to her. Did he regret his proposal, and was he covering his retreat by putting on some sort of act? But then he could simply leave and not come back. A man who had been in business all his life would surely have the necessary callousness for that. Harry remembered. Noticing certain signs in Arnheim that indicated passion in an older man, his face was sometimes a greyish-yellow, slack and tired, like a room with the bed still unmade at noon. The most likely explanation was the havoc caused by two almost equally strong passions fighting each other to a standstill. But since he was incapable of imagining the passion for power in the degree to which it ruled Amim, he could not conceive of the measures love had to take in order to fight it. "You're an odd sort of man," Diotima said. "Always different from what one would expect. Wasn't it you who spoke to me of seraphic love? You regard it as a possibility?" Ulrich asked absent-mindedly. "Not as you described it, of course. So Arnheim loves you seraphically?" Ulrich began to laugh softly. "I wish you wouldn't laugh." Diotima almost hissed at him. "You don't understand," he apologized, "and it's only the excitement. You and Arnheim are sensitive people. You love poetry. I'm sure that you are sometimes touched by a breath. A breath of something, the question is just what that is. And now you want to get to the bottom of it, with all the thoroughness of your idealism. Aren't you always saying that one must be precise and thorough?" Diotima countered. It was too much. "You are mad," he said. "Forgive my saying so, but you are mad. And you of all people mustn't be." Meanwhile Arnheim had been telling the general that for the last 2 generations the world had been undergoing the most profound revolution of all. The end of the soul was in sight. It gave the genera a stab. What the devil? Here was yet another problem to think about. To be honest, he had thought until this moment, despite Diotima, that there was no such thing as the soul. At military school and in the regiment, nobody gave a hang about this kind of preacher's talk. But here was this manufacturer of guns and tanks, talking about the soul as though he could see it standing there. The general's eyes began to itch and to roll around gloomily, goggling at the translucent air around them. But Arnheim was not waiting to be asked for particulars. Words flowed from his lips, from that pale pink slit between his clipped moustache and his little pointed beard. As he phrased it, the soul had started to shrivel and age ever since the church began to crumble, around the beginning of the bourgeois era. Since then it had lost God and all solid values and ideals until the present, when men had actually reached the point of living without morals, without principles, without real experiences, in fact. The general could not quite see why one could not have experiences if one had no morals. Whereupon Arnheim opened the big volume bound in pigskin that he was holding, revealing an expensive facsimile of a manuscript so valuable that even a mortal of Arnheim's extraordinary standing could not be permitted to take the original out of the building. The general saw the depiction of an angel with wings spread horizontally across 2 pages, against a background of dark earth, golden sky, and marvelous colors layered like clouds. He was looking at a reproduction of one of the most moving and splendid of early medieval paintings, but since he did not know this, while he did know all about bird hunting and depictions of it, he could only conclude that a creature with wings and a long neck that was neither human nor a snipe must be an aberration to which his companion wished to draw his attention. Mime was pointing his finger at it and saying pensively, "Here you see what that great lady who is creating the Austrian campaign is trying to bring back into the world." I see, Sturm said, realizing that he had failed to appreciate this thing for what it was and that he had better watch his step. The great expressiveness, and with such utter simplicity, Mime went on, bears witness to what our age has lost forever. What is our science compared with this? Patchwork. Our art? Extremes, without mediating substance to hold them together. We lack the magic key to unity, and this, you see, is why I am so deeply moved by this Austrian plan to set the world an example of unification, of a shared idea, even though I do not quite believe it can be done. I am a German. Everything in the world today is loud and crude, and Germany is the loudest. In every country the people are straining themselves morning, noon, and night, whether at work or at play, but in Germany they start earlier and stop later than anywhere else. In all the world the spirit of cold calculation and brute force has lost touch with the soul, but we in Germany have the most businessmen and the strongest army in the world. He looked around the square with delight. Here in Austria, things have not yet gone so far. The past is still with you, and the people have kept something of their original intuitiveness. If the German spirit can still be saved from rationalism, this is the only place left from which a start can be made. But I am afraid, he added with a sigh, we can hardly succeed. A great idea nowadays encounters too much resistance. Great ideas just barely help to prevent each other from being misused. We are living in a state of moral truce, as it were, armed to the teeth with ideas. He smiled at his own joke. Then something more occurred to him. You know, the difference between Germany and Austria we have just touched on always reminds me of billiards. Even at billiards everything goes wrong if you try to do it all by calculation instead of with feeling. The general had guessed that he was supposed to feel flattered by the reference to a moral armed truce, and he wanted to show that he had been paying attention. He did know something about billiards, so he said, I play snooker myself, and skittles too, but I never heard that there's a difference between the Austrian and the German styles you off-play. Mime shut his eyes and gave it some thought. I myself never play billiards, he said after a moment, but I know that you can play the ball high or low, from the right or from the left, that you can strike the second ball head-on or merely graze it, that you can hit it hard or lightly, bluff a little or a lot, and there must be many more such options. Now, if you imagine each of these elements with all their inherent gradations, you have an almost infinite number of possible combinations. To state them theoretically, I should have to take into account, besides the laws of mathematics and statics, the mechanics of solids, plus the laws of elasticity. I would have to know the coefficients of the materials, the influence of the temperature, the most precise means of measuring the coordination and gradation of my motor impulses, of estimating distances exactly, like Ananias, how to combine the various factors with better than the speed and accuracy of a slide rule, to say nothing of allowing for margins of error, fields of dispersal, and the fact that the aim, which is the correct coincidence of the two balls, is in itself not clearly definable but only a collection of barely adequate data round an average value. Arnheim spoke slowly, and in a middle-tilde way that compelled attention, as though pouring a liquid drop by drop from a vial to a glass. He did not spare his interlocutor a single detail. And so you see, he continued, that I should need to have all the qualities, and do all the things, I cannot possibly have and do. You must be enough of a mathematician to see that. It would take a lifetime to plan a single carom essay shot in that fashion. It boggles the mind. And yet I step up to the table with a cigarette between my lips, a tune in my ear, and my hat on, as it were, and hardly bothering to look over the board. I take my cue to the ball and the problem is solved. General, this is the sort of thing that happens all the time in real life. You are not only an Austrian, you are a military man, so you're bound to understand me. Politics, honor, war, art, all the crucial processes of life, take place beyond the scope of the conscious rational mind. Man's greatness is rooted in the irrational. Even we businessmen don't really operate by calculation, not the leading men, that is. The little fellows may have to count their pennies. We learn to regard our really successful moves as a mystery that defies analysis. A man who doesn't care deeply about feeling, morality, religion, music, poetry, form, discipline, chivalry, generosity, crew/door, tolerance, believe me, such a man will never make a businessman of real stature. This is why I have always admired the military, especially the Austrian military, based as it is on age-old traditions, and I am truly delighted that Frau Tutsi can count on your support. It is a relief to me to know it. Your influence, with that of our younger friend, is extremely important. All great things rest on the same principles. Great obligations are a blessing, General. To his own surprise, he suddenly found himself spontaneously shaking Stumm's hand. Then he ended by saying, "Hardly anyone realizes that true greatness has no rational basis. I mean to say, everything strong is simple." Stumm von Board held his breath. He was not sure he understood a word of it all, and wished he could rush back into the library and spend hours reading upon all these points that the great man had paid him the compliment of making to him. At last, out of this March gale whirling in his mind, there came a piercing ray of lucidity. "What the hell," he thought, "this fellow wants something from me." He looked up. Arnheim was still holding the book in both hands but was now turning his attention seriously to hailing a cab. His face was slightly flushed with animation, like that of a man who has just been trading ideas with another. The general was silent, like a man awed by a portentous thought. If Arnheim wanted something from him, then General Stumm was free to want something from Aim too, to the advantage of His Majesty's service. This perception opened such vistas of possibility that Stumm put off thinking about just what it all really meant. But if the angel in the book had suddenly lifted up a wing to give clever General Essam a glimpse of what was hidden underneath, the general could not have felt more bewildered and overjoyed. Over in Diotima's and Ulrich's Kammer, the following question had meanwhile been posed: should a woman in Diotima's difficult position make a gesture of renunciation, or let herself be swept into adultery, or take a third, mixed course, such as belonging physically to one man and spiritually to another, or perhaps physically to neither? For this third solution there was as yet no libretto, as it were, only some great harmonic chords. Diotima still wanted it understood that she was absolutely not speaking of herself but speaking only of a woman. Every time Ulrich tried to fuse the two together he got a warning glance from her. And so he also chose a devious course. "Have you ever seen a dog?" he asked. "You only think you have. What you see is only something you feel more or less justified in regarding as a dog. It isn't a dog in every respect T, and always has some personal quality no other dog has. So how can we ever hope, in this life, to do the right thing? A1. We can do is something that's never the right thing and is always both more a middle dot and less than that. Has a tile ever fallen off the roof in precise accord with the law of falling bodies? Never. Even in the lab, things never behave just as they should. 11ly diverge from the ideal course in all possible directions, while we keep up a fiction that this is to be blamed on our faulty execution of the experiment, and that somewhere midway up of .ct result is obtainable. Or else you find certain stones, and because of the properties they have in common they are all regarded as diamonds. But suppose one of them comes from Africa. And another from Asia, one is dug out of the ground by a black man and the other by an Oriental. What if these differences in circumstances were to matter so much that they cancel out what the objects have in common? In TH equation diamond plus circumstances is still diamond, the use value of the diamond is so great that it makes the value of the circumstances negligible. But it's possible to imagine spiritual circumstances in which the situation is reversed. Everything partakes of the universal and also has something special all its own. Everything is both true to type and refuses to conform to type and is in a category all its own, simultaneously. The personal quality of any given creature is precisely that which doesn't coincide with anything else. I once said to you that the more truth we discover, the less of the personal is left in the world, because of the long time war again. St individuality that individuality is losing. By the time everything has been rationalized, there's no telling how much of us will be left. Nothing at all. Possibly, but then, when the false significance we attach to personality has gone, we may enter upon a new kind of significance as if embarking upon a splendid adventure. So how do you decide? Should a woman go by the law? Then she may as well go by the laws of society. Conventional morality is a perfectly valid average and collective value, to be utterly adhered to, without deviations, wherever it is acknowledged. But no individual case can be decided on moral grounds alone. Morality is irrelevant to it in the precise degree that it shares in the inexhaustible nature of the universe. That was quite a speech, Diotima said. She took a certain satisfaction in the loftiness of discourse being imposed upon her, but intended to gain the upper hand by not talking in equally wild generalities. But what is a woman to do, given the circumstances, in real life? Let things happen, Ulrich answered. What things? Whatever happens. Her husband, her lover, her renunciation, her mixed feelings. Do you have any idea what you are saying? Diotima asked, feeling painfully reminded of how her high resolve possibly to give up Aim had its wings clipped every night by the mere fact that she slept in Tutsi.s bed. Ulrich must have sensed some of this, because he asked her bluntly, would you try your luck with me? With you? Diotima drawled, then decided to save face by taking a humorous tack. If this is an offer, just what is it you have in mind? I'll tell you, Ulrich replied seriously. You read a great deal, don't you? Of course. What is it you do, then? I'll tell you, you leave out whatever doesn't suit you. As the author himself has done before you. Just as you leave things out of your dreams or fantasies. By leaving things out, we bring beauty and excitement into the world. We evidently handle our reality by effecting some sort of compromise with it, an in-between state where the emotions prevent each other from reaching their fullest intensity, graying the colors somewhat. Children who haven't yet reached that point of control are both happier and unhappier than adults who have. And yes, stupid people also leave things out, which is why ignorance is bliss. So I propose, to begin with, That we try to love each other as if we were characters in a novel who have met in the pages of a book. Let's in any case leave off all the fatty tissue that plumps up reality. Diotima felt called upon to argue the case. She wanted to direct the conversation away from this too personal vein, and she also wanted to show that she understood something of the problems that had been touched upon. All well and good, she said, but art is supposed to afford us a vacation from reality, so that we can return to it with our energies restored. And I am opinionated enough to say that there should be no time off, her cousin retorted. What sort of a life is it that we have to drill holes in it called holidays? Would we punch holes in a painting because it makes too strenuous demands on our sense of beauty? Should we look forward to taking time off from eternal bliss in the next world? Even the thought of time taken off my life by having to sleep sometimes seems unacceptable to me. Ah, there it is. Diotima seized her opportunity. You see how unnatural it all is, what you're saying? What human being doesn't need to rest and take a break? It's a perfect illustration of the difference between you and a mime. Yours is a mind that will not acknowledge the shadow on things, the dark side, while his has developed out of the fullness of human experience, with sunshine and shadow intermingled. Of course I exaggerate, Ulrich admitted coolly. You will see it even more clearly as we go into more detail. Think of the great writers, for instance. We can model our lives on them. But we can't squeeze life out of them, like wine out of grapes. They have given so solid a form to what once moved them that it confronts us like pressed metal even between the lines. But what have they actually said? Nobody knows. They themselves never knew all of it at a time. They're like a field over which bees fly back and forth, they themselves are flying back and forth, as it were. Their thoughts and feelings show all the gradations between truth and even error, as can be demonstrated if necessary, and changeable natures that come close to us at will and then elude us when we try to observe them closely. There is no detaching an idea in a book from its context on the page. It catches our eye like the face of a person looming up in a crowd as it is being swept past us. I suppose I'm exaggerating a little again, but tell me, what happens in our lives that is any different from this? Leaving the precise, measurable, and definable sensory data out of account, all the other concepts on which we base our lives are no more than congealed metaphors. Take as simple a concept as manliness, and think how it keeps wavering among its many possible variants. It's like a breath that changes shape at every exhalation, with nothing to hold on to, no fin impression, no logic. So when we simply leave out in art whatever doesn't suit us and our conceptions, we're merely going back to the original condition of life itself. My dear friend, Diotima said, you don't seem to be talking about anything in particular. Ulrich had paused for a moment, and her words fell into that pause. Yes, I suppose so. I hope I haven't been talking too loudly. You've been talking fast, in a low voice, and at length, she said, with a touch of sarcasm. Without saying a word of what you meant to say. Do you realize what you've just explained to me all over again? That reality should be abolished. It's true that when I heard you make this point the first time, on one of our trips into the country, think, it made a lasting impression. I don't know why. But how this is to be done is something you haven't yet revealed, I'm sorry to say. Clearly, I'd have to go on talking for at least as long again to do so. But do you really expect it to be that simple? If I'm not mistaken, you spoke of wanting to fly away with Arnheim into some kind of transcendent state. Something you regard as another kind of reality. What I have been saying, on the other hand, is that we must try to recover unreality. Reality no longer makes sense. Oh, Arnheim would hardly agree with you there, Diotima said. Of course not. That's just the difference between him and me. He is trying to make the fact that he eats, sleeps, is the great Arnheim, and doesn't know whether to marry you or not, mean something, and to this end he has been culminating all the treasures of the mind throughout his life. Ulrich suddenly paused, and the silence lengthened. After while he asked, in a different tone, can you explain to me why I should be having this conversation with you, of all people? Suddenly I'm reminded of my childhood. You won't believe this, but I was a good child, mild as the air on a warm moonlit night. I could fall madly in love with a dog, a pocket knife. But then he left this statement unfinished too. Diotima looked at him, wondering what he could mean. She again remembered how he had once hotly advocated precision of feeling, while just now he was taking the opposite view. He had accused Arnheim of insufficiently clean-cut intentions, while now he favored letting things happen. And she was troubled by the fact that Ulrich was advocating an intense emotional life without any time off, compared with Amim's ambiguous suggestion never to let oneself in for single-minded hatred or total love. These thoughts left her uneasy. Do you really believe that there is such a thing as boundless feeling? Ulrich asked her. Oh yes, there is such a thing as boundless emotion, Diotima said, the ground thin under her feet again. You see, I don't quite believe that, Ulrich said absently. Strange how often we talk about it, but we certainly do our best to avoid it throughout our lives, as if we were afraid of drowning in it. He noticed that Diotima was not listening. She was up easily watching Amim, who was looking around for a cab. Trademark afraid we ought to rescue him from the general, she said. I'll go and get a cab and take the general off your hands, Ulrich offered, and at the moment he turned to go, Diotima laid her hand on his arm and said kindly, as if to reward him for his trouble, any feeling that isn't boundless is worthless. 115. The tip of your breast is like a poppy leaf, In accordance with the law that periods of great stability tend to be followed by violent upheavals, Benedilla, too, suffered a relapse. Her attempts to get on closer terms with Diotima had failed, and her fine scheme to get even with Ulrich by making friends with her rival, leaving Ulrich out in the cold day fantasy she had spent much time in spinning out, had come to nothing. She had to swallow her pride and come knocking on his door again, but when she was there her beloved seemed to have arranged for constant interruptions, and her stories to account for her coming to see him again even though he did not deserve it were wasted on his impervious friendliness. She was longing to make a terrible scene but committed to behaving with absolute propriety, so that in time she came to hate herself for being so good. At night her head, heavy with unappeased cravings, sat on her shoulders like a coconut with its mat of monkey-like hair growing freakishly inside the shell, and she came close to bursting with helpless rage, like a drinker deprived of his bottle. She privately called Diotima every name she could think of, such as fraud and insufferable pompous bitch, and came up with cynical glosses on that noble femininity which was the secret of Diotima's charm. Her aping of Diotima's style, which had delighted her for a while, had now become a prison from which she broke out into an almost licentious freedom. Her curling iron and mirror lost the power to turn her into an idealized image of herself, and the artificial state of mind it had supported collapsed as well. Even sleep, which Benedilla had always reveled in despite her chronic inner conflicts, sometimes kept her waiting when she had a game to bed, an experience so new to her that she thought she must be sick with insomnia, and felt what people usually feel when they are seriously ill, that her spirit was deserting her body, leaving it helpless like a wounded soldier on the battlefield. As she lay there in her vexations as if on red-hot sand, all that high-minded talk of Diotima's, which Benedilla had so admired, seemed to her infinitely beside the point, and she honestly despised it. When she found it impossible to go to Ulrich yet again, she thought of another scheme to bring him back to his senses. It was of course the culmination of the plan that came to her first, a vision of herself effecting an entrance at Diotima's when that siren had Ulrich with her. Benedilla regarded all his visits with Diotima as transparent pretexts for carrying on their flirtation rather than actually doing something for the public good. So it was up to Benedilla to do something for the public good, and this gave her the opening gambit of her plan as well. No one was paying any attention to Muusbrugger anymore, and he was going to his doom, while all the others were pontificating about it. Benedilla never stopped to wonder that it was Muusbrugger once more who came to her rescue in her hour of need. Had she bothered to think about him at all, she would have been horrified, but all she was thinking was that if Ulrich cared so much about Muusbrugger, she would see to it that he would at least not forget the man. And she mulled over her plan. She remembered two things Ulrich had said when they were talking about the murderer, namely, that everyone had a second soul, which was always innocent, and that a responsible person could always choose to do otherwise, but an irresponsible person had no such choice. From this she somehow concluded that she wanted to be irresponsible, which would mean that she would also be innocent, which Ulrich was not, and which he needed to be, for his own salvation. So motivated, and dressed as for a social occasion, she spent several evenings wandering up and down one past Diotima's windows, and never had long to wait before they lit up along the whole front, betokening something going on inside. She had told her husband that she was invited out but would not stay too long, and in the course of a few days, while SH was still trying to screw up her courage, her lies and her strolls in front of a house where she had no business to be unleashed a growing impulse that would soon drive her up those steps to the front door. What if she was seen by some acquaintance, or even by her husband if he should pass that way by chance, or what if she was noticed by the doorman, or by a policeman, who might decide to question her? The more often she went out on this expedition, the greater the risks, and the more probable that if she hesitated too long an incident would occur. Now, it was true that Benedilla more than once slipped into doorways or places where she did not want to be seen, but on those occasions she had been fortified by the thought that it had to be. This time she was about to intrude where she was not expected and could not be sure of her reception. She felt like an assassin who has started out with none too clear an idea of what it would be like, and is then swept by circumstances into a state in which the actual pistol shot or the glitter of vitriol drops flying through the air no longer adds much to the excitement. Without any such dramatic intentions, Benedilla nevertheless felt similarly benumbed by the time she actually found herself pressing the doorbell and walking inside. Little Rachel had slipped over to Ulrich and told him that someone was waiting out in the hall to see him, not mentioning that this someone was a heavily veiled unknown lady who, when Rachel shut the door to the salon behind him, flung the veil back from her face. At the moment she was absolutely convinced that Muusbrugger's fate depended on her taking instant action, and she received Ulrich not like a lover plagued by jealousy, but gasping for breath like a marathon runner. With no effort, she lied that her husband had told her yesterday that Muusbrugger would soon be past saving. "There's nothing I hate so much," she ended, "as this obscene kind of murder. But even though it goes against my grain, I've taken the risk of being regarded as an intruder here, because you must go straight back to the lady of the house and her very influential guests and get their help if you still want to get anything done." She had no idea what she expected to come of this. Perhaps that Ulrich would be deeply moved and would thank her, then call Diotima, who would then take Benedilla into some private place to talk, away from the other guests. Or else Diotima might be drawn to the hall by the sound of voices, and Benedilla was ready to let her see that she, Benedilla, was far from being the person least qualified to take an interest in Ulrich's noble causes. Her eyes were moist and flashed Her hands trembled, her voice rose out of control. Ulrich, deeply embarrassed, smiled desperately to quiet her down and gain time while he found a way to talk her into leaving as quickly as possible. It was a ticklish situation and could have ended with Benadia's having a screaming or crying fit if Rachel had not come to his aid. Little Rachel had been standing close by all this time, with wide open, shining eyes. When the beautiful stranger, trembling all over, had asked to speak to Ulrich, the maid had instantly divined the romantic nature of the affair. She managed to hear most of what was said, and the syllables of Muusbrugger's name fell on her ear like pistol shots. The sadness, passion, and jealousy throbbing in this lady's voice moved her powerfully, although she knew nothing of what was behind it. She guessed that the woman was Ulrich's mistress, and it doubled her infatuation with him. It was as though the two of them had burst into full-throated song together and made her want to lift up her own voice and join in, or do something to help. And so, with a glance enjoining secrecy, she opened a door and invited the pair into the only room not being used for the gathering this evening. It was Rachel's FLRST conscious act of disloyalty to her mistress, and she knew what would happen if she was found out, but life was so exciting, and romantic passion such an untidy state of mind, that she had no chance to think twice about it. When the gaslight flamed upward 11D Benadia's eyes gradually took in her surroundings, her legs almost gave way under her, and her cheeks flushed red with jealousy. They were inside Diotima's bedroom. There were stockings, hairbrushes, and much else lying around, whatever is left in view when a woman must change hastily from head to foot for a big party and the maid has not had time to put things away or has left it till the next morning, as in this case, because the room was due for a thorough cleaning then anyway. On big party evenings the bedroom was used to store furnishings from the other rooms where the space was needed. So the air was heavy with the smell of all this furniture jammed together, and of powder, soap, and scent. What a silly thing for the girl to do, Ulrich said with a laugh. We can't stay here. Anyway, you shouldn't have come. There's nothing to be done for Muusbrugger. So I shouldn't have bothered, is that it? Benadia echoed him almost inaudibly. Her eyes strayed all over the place. How could the girl have even thought of taking Ulrich into the most private room in the house, she wondered in anguish, if she had not done it often before. Yet she could not bring herself to confront him with this proof of his infidelity, but chose instead to say dully, how can you sleep in peace when such injustice is being done? I haven't been able to sleep at night, which is why I decided to come looking for you. She had turned her back on the room and stood staring out the window into the opaque, glassy darkness outside, at what might be treetops or some deep courtyard down below. Upset as she was, she had enough sense of orientation to know that she was not looking out on the street, and when she considered that here she was in her rival's bedroom, standing in a flood of light in the uncurtained window beside her faithless lover, as on a stage in front of an unseen audience, it threw her mind into turmoil. She had taken off her hat and thrown her coat back, her forehead and the warm tips of her breasts touched the cold window pane, tenderness and tears moistened her eyes. Slowly she freed herself from the spell and turned back to her friend, but her eyes still held some of that soft, yielding darkness she had gazed into, and were deeper than she knew. Ulrich, she said with feeling, you're not a bad man. You only pretend to be. You go to a lot of trouble to be as good as you can be. These incongruously perceptive words of Benadia's made the situation precarious again. For once, they were not the ridiculous desire of a woman to mask her body's demands for consolation with an overlay of lofty sentiment, but the beauty of that body itself claiming its right to the gentle dignity of love. Ulrich went up to her and put his arm around her shoulder. Together they turned and looked into the darkness outside. A faint glimmer of light from the house was dissolving in the infinite darkness beyond so that it looked like a dense mist softening the air, and Ulrich felt as if he were staring out into a mildly chilly October night. Though it was late winter, the whole city seemed wrapped in a vast woolen blanket. Then it occurred to him that one could just as well say that a woolen blanket resembled a night in October. He felt a gentle uncertainty on his skin and drew Benadia closer. Will you go back to them now? Benadia asked. And save Muusbrugger from injustice? No, I don't even know whether injustice is being done to him. What do I really know about him? I saw him once, just a glimpse in a courtroom, and I've read a few things that were written about him. It's as though I had dreamed that the tip of your breast is like a poppy leaf. Does that give me the right to think it is any such thing? He stopped to think. So did Benadia. He was thinking, one human being, when you think of it, means nothing more to another one than a string of similes. Benadia's thinking concluded with, come, let's get away from here. That's impossible, Ulrich told her. They would wonder about my disappearance, and then if something should leak out about your coming here, it could cause quite a scandal. Again they both fell silent, staring out the window together, into something that could have been a night in October, a night in January, a woolen blanket, sorrow, or joy, though they didn't attempt to define it. Why do you never do the natural next thing? Benadia asked. He suddenly remembered a recent dream. He was one of those people who seldom have dreams, or at least never remember their dreams, so that it gave him a queer feeling to have this unexpected memory opening up and letting him in. In the dream, he had kept trying to cross a steep mountainside and was driven back, again and again, by violent dizzy spells. Without trying to interpret it, he now knew that the dream was about Muusbrugger, who never actually appeared in it. Since a dream image often has several meanings, it was also a physical representation of his mind's useless struggles to make some he dotted way, as recently manifested again and again in his conversation and in his affairs, struggles that exactly resemble walking without a path to follow, and being unable to get beyond a certain point. He could not help smiling at the ingenuous concreteness of the dream imagery for this, smooth rock and slippery earth undertoot, the occasional lone tree to hold onto or to aim for, the abrupt increase in the steepness of the grade as he went. He had tried and failed to make it on a higher and a lower route and was growing sick with vertigo, when he said to someone with him, "Let's give it up, there's the easy road down there in the valley that everyone takes." The meaning was obvious. Incidentally, it occurred to Ulrich that the person a middle dot with him might very well have been Benadia. It was quite possible that he had also dreamed of her nipple as a poppy leaf, some unconnected thing that might, to the groping touch, easily seem broad and jagged, the dark purplish hue of mallow, floating like a mist from some as yet unlit cranny in the dream world. Now he experienced a moment of that special lucidity that lights up everything going on behind the scenes of oneself, though one may be far from being able to express it. He understood the relationship between a dream and what it expresses, which is no more than an analogy, a metaphor, something he often thought about. A metaphor holds a truth and an untruth, felt as inextricably bound up with each other. If one takes it as it is and gives it some sensual form, in the shape of reality, one gets dreams and art, but between these two and real, full-scale life there is a glass partition. If one analyzes it for its rational content and separates the unverifiable from the verifiable, one gets truth and knowledge but kills the feeling. Like certain kinds of bacteria that split an organic substance into two parts, mankind splits the originally ng body of the metaphor into the firm substance of reality and truth, and the glassy unreality of intuition, faith, and artifact. There seems to be nothing in between, and yet how often a vaguely conceived undertaking does succeed, if only one goes ahead without worrying it too much. Ulrich felt that he had at last emerged from the tangle of streets through which his thoughts and moods had so often taken him, into the central square where all streets had their beginning. And he touched on all this in answering Benadia's question as to why he never did the natural next thing. She probably did not understand his answer, but this was decidedly one of her good days. After thinking it over, she slipped her arm more firmly into his and summed it all up by saying, "Well, in your dreams you don't think either, you only live through some story or other." This was almost true. He squeezed her hand. Suddenly her eyes filled with tears again. They coursed slowly down her cheeks, and from her skin, bathed in those salty tears, there arose the indefinable scent of desire. Ulrich breathed it in and felt a great longing for this slippery nebulous state, for surrender and forgetfulness. But he pulled himself together and led her tenderly to the door. At this moment he felt sure that there was still something ahead of him and that he must not fritter it away in half-hearted attachments. "You must go now," he said gently, "and don't be angry with me because I don't know when we can see each other again. I have a great deal to work out for myself just now. And wonder of wonders." Benadia put up no resistance and said nothing in anger or wounded pride. Her jealousy was gone. She felt that she was herself part of a story. She felt like taking him in her arms, seeing that he needed to be brought down to earth again, and was tempted to make the sign of the cross over his forehead for his protection, as she did with her children. It was all so romantic that it never occurred to her that it could be the end. She put on her hat and kissed him, and then she kissed him again through her veil, so that the threads seemed to glow like red-hot wires. With the help of Rachel, who had been guarding the door and listening, Benadia managed to slip away unseen, even though the party was breaking up and people were coming out. Ulrich pressed a big tip into Rachel's hand and complimented her on her presence of mind, making Rachel so ecstatic that her fingers unconsciously kept clutching his hand with the money. He had to laugh, when she blushed scarlet at this. He patted her on the shoulder. The two trees of life and a proposal to establish a general secretariat for precision and soul. That evening at the Tuzzies, there had been fewer guests than formerly, attendance at meetings of the parallel campaign was falling off, and people tended to leave earlier. Even the last-minute appearance of His Grace, who incidentally looked worried and preoccupied, and was in a bad mood, in fact, because he had received disturbing news about the nationalist intrigues against his work, could not prevent the party from breaking up. People lingered on for a bit in the expectation that he had brought some special news, but then, when he gave no sign of having anything of the kind to report and paid scant attention to the remaining guests, even the last of them left. By the time Ulrich reappeared, he was shocked to see the rooms almost empty. Shortly after WLL only the innermost circle was left, joined by Section Chief Tutsi, who had meanwhile come home. His Grace had reverted to a favourite topic. "Of course we can regard an 88-year-old monarch of peace as a symbol. It gives us so much to think about. But it must be gift.10 a political content as well. Without that, it is only too natural people to lose interest. In other words, as far as I am concerned, I've done all I could. The German nationalists are furious with me for appointing Wisniewski, whom they regard as a Slavophile, and the Slavs are furious because, as far as they're concerned, when he was in the government he was a wolf in sheep's clothing. All that only goes to show that he is a true patriot who stands above parties, and I wouldn't think of dropping him. However, we must supplement this with all possible speed on the cultural front, so that people have something positive to go on. Our public opinion survey of what the various population sectors want is moving far too slowly. An Austrian year or a world year of Austria is a splendid idea, of course, but I must say that every symbol must in due course come into something real. That is to say, I can let myself be deeply moved by a symbol without necessarily understanding it. But after a while I am bound to come away from the mirror of my heart and get something else done, something I have meanwhile found needs doing. I wonder if I have managed to make my point? Our admirable friend the lady of the house is doing her utmost, and the discussions that have been held in this house for months have been most fruitful, I'm sure, but attendance is falling off nevertheless, and I have a feeling that we shall soon have to decide on something definite. I don't know what it will be, perhaps a second steeple on St. Stephen's, or an imperial and royal colony in Africa, it doesn't matter what, it's sure to come into something else at the last moment anyway. The main thing is to harness the inventiveness of the participants in time, before it all dribbles away. Count Lonsdorff felt that he had spoken to the point. Aim now took the floor on everybody else's behalf. What you say about the need, at times, to fructify thought by taking action, even if only pro turn, is most realistic and is true to life in general. You will be interested to know that there is a new mood, corresponding to what you say, among those of us meeting here regularly. We are no longer being swamped with an endless stream of considerations, almost no new proposals are being put forward now, and the older proposals are hardly ever mentioned, or at any rate nobody is fighting for them in any persistent way. Everyone seems to realize that in accepting the invitation to take part in this campaign he has obligated himself to come to an agreement, so that any acceptable proposal would now stand a good chance of being approved. And how are we coming along, my dear fellow? Said his grace, turning to Ulrich, whom he had spotted meanwhile. Can we see our way to winding it up? Ulrich had to admit that it was not so. An exchange of views can be drawn out on paper to everyone's pleasure for far longer than in person, and even the influx of proposed reforms had not abated D. So that he was still founding organizations and referring them, in his grace's name, to the various government departments whose readiness to deal with them had, however, shown a marked decline lately. This was what he had to report. No wonder, his grace commented, turning to the others. There's no dearth of patriotism among the population, but one would have to be as well informed as an encyclopedia to satisfy all the people on every point they bring up. Our government departments simply can't cope, which proves that the time has come for us to intervene from above. In this connection Arnheim spoke up again. Your grace might be interested to note that General von Board has been attracting increasing interest in the council of late. Count Lonsdorff looked at the general for the first time. In what way? He asked without in the least bothering to mask the rudeness of his question. Oh, how very embarrassing. I never intended anything of the kind, Sturm von Board murmured bashfully. The role of the soldier in the council chamber can only be a modest one, that's always been a principle with me. But your grace may remember that at the very first meeting, only doing my duty as a soldier, so to speak, I suggested that if the committee had no better idea, they might remember that our artillery has no up-to-date guns and our navy, for that matter, has no ships, not enough ships, that is, to defend a country if that should ever have to be done. And his grace interrupted him and shot a surprised, questioning look at Diotima that made a real secret of his displeasure. Diotima shrugged her beautiful shoulders in resignation. She had almost become hardened to the fact that wherever she might turn, the pudgy little general popped up like a nightmare, as if sponsored by some sinister forces. And lately, you see, Sturm von Board hastened to say before his modesty could get the better of him in the face of his success, voices have been raised that would support such a proposal if someone were to come forward with it. It is being said, in fact, that the army and the navy are a concept behind which all could rally, and a great concept too, after all, and his majesty would be pleased as well. Besides, it would be an eye-opener for the Prussians. No offense, I hope, Herr von Arnheim. Not at all, General. The Prussians wouldn't be at all disconcerted by it. Arnheim waved this aside with a smile. Besides, it goes without saying that whenever such Austrian concerns come up I am simply not present, even while I most humbly take the liberty of listening in any way. Well then, in any case, the general concluded, opinions have in fact been expressed that the simplest thing would be not to keep talking much longer but to settle for a military solution. For myself, I'd be inclined to think that this could be done in combination with something else, some great civilian concept, perhaps, but as I say, it's not for a soldier to interfere, and views to the effect that nothing better is likely to come out of all this civilian thinking have just been voiced in the most intellectual quarters. Toward the end of the general's speech, his grace was listening with a fixed stare, and only involuntary twitchings in the direction of twiddling his thumbs, which he could not quite suppress, betrayed the strain of his painful inner workings. Section Chief Tutsi, whose voice was not usually heard on these occasions, now slipped in a comment, speaking slowly and in a low tone, I don't believe the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would have any objections. Aha, so the departments have been in touch on this subject already? Count Lonsdorff asked ironically, in a tone betraying his irritation. Unshaken, Tutsi replied affably, Your Grace is joking. The War Department would sooner welcome universal disarmament than have any truck with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He went on to tell a little story. Your Grace must have heard about the fortifications in the southern Tyrol that have been built during the last 10 years at the insistence of the Chief of the General Staff. They are said to be perfectly splendid, quite the latest thing. They have of course also been equipped with electrically charged barbed wire and huge searchlights that get their current from underground diesel engines. No one could say that we're behind the times in this. The only trouble is that the engines were ordered by the artillery, and the fuel is provided by the War Ministry's Department int of Works, according to regulations, which is why the fortifications can't be made operational. B. Cause the two authorities can't agree on whether the match that has to be used to start the engine should be regarded as fuel and supplied by the Department of Works, or as a mechanical part for which the artillery is responsible. How delightful. Arnhem said, though he knew that Tutsi was confusing a diesel engine with a gas engine and that even with gas it was a long time since matches had been used. It was the kind of story that circulates in government offices, full of enjoyable self-deprecation, and the section chief had told it in a tone of tolerant amusement. Everyone smiled or laughed, none more appreciatively than General Sturm. Of course, it's the civilians in the other departments who are really to blame, he said, to take the joke a little further. Because the minute we order something not regularly provided for in the budget, the finance ministry loses no time in reminding us that we don't know the first thing about the workings of constitutional government. So if war were to break out, God forbid, before the end of the fiscal year, we would have to telegraph the commanding officers of these fortifications at dawn, on the first day of mobilization, empowering them to buy matches, and if there were none to be had in those mountain villages, the war would have to be conducted with the matches in the pockets of the officers' orderlies. The general had probably gone a little too far in his elaboration of the joke, as its humor thinned out. The dire seriousness of the problems facing the parallel campaign became apparent again. His Grace said pensively, as time goes on, I sense but then he remembered that it is wise in a difficult situation to let the others do the talking, and did not finish. The 6 persons present were silent for a moment, as though they were all standing around a deep well, staring down into it. No, Diotima said, that's impossible. What? All eyes seemed to ask. We would only be doing what Germany is accused of, arming for war. Her soul had paid no attention to the anecdotes, or had forgotten them already, arrested at the moment of the general's success. But what is to be done? Count Lonsdorff asked gratefully, but still troubled. We must look for some temporary expedient, at the very least. Germany is a relatively naive country, bristling with energy, Amim said, as though he felt called upon to apologize to his lady on behalf of his country. It has been handed gunpowder and schnapps. Tutsi smiled at this metaphor, which struck him more than daring. There's no denying that Germany is regarded with growing distaste in those circles to which our campaign is meant to appeal. Count Lonsdorff did not pass up the opportunity to slip this in. And even, I am sorry to say, in those circles it has already appealed to, he added, for a wonder. Amim surprised him by stating that he was not unaware of it. We Germans, he said, are an ill-fated nation. Not only do we live in the heart of Europe, we even suffer the pains of this heart. Heart? Count Lonsdorff asked involuntarily. He would have been prepared for brain HD would have more readily acceded to this. But Amim insisted on heart. Do you remember, he asked, that not so long ago the City Council of Prague awarded a very large order to France, although we had also made a tender, of course, and would have filled our order more efficiently and more cheaply? It is simply an emotional prejudice at work. And I must admit that I fully understand it. Before he could go on, Sturm von Bord was happy to elucidate. All over the world, he said, people are struggling desperately, but in Germany they're struggling even harder. All over the world a lot of noise is being made, but even more in Germany. Business has lost touch with traditional culture everywhere, but most of all in Germany. Everywhere the flower of youth is stuck into barracks as a matter of course, but the Germans have more barracks than anyone else. And so we are bound, in a way, as brothers, not to hang back too far behind Germany, he concluded. If all this sounds a bit paradoxical, I hope you'll all excuse me, but such are the complications faced by the intellect nowadays. Amim nodded in agreement. America may be even worse than we are, he added, but America is at least utterly naive, without our intellectual conflicts. We Germans are in every respect the nation at the center of things, where all the world's currents crisscross. More than any other we need a synthesis. And we know it. We have a sense of sin, as it were. But admitting this frankly, at the outset, I think it is only fair to pledge that we also suffer for the others, that we take their faults upon ourselves, so to speak, and that in a sense we are being cursed or crucified, however you might want to put it, on behalf of the whole world. A change of heart in Germany would probably be the most significant thing that could happen. I rather suspect that some vague idea of this is present in that conflicted and, as it seems, somewhat impassioned opposition to us of which you have just spoken. Now Ulrich joined in, you gentlemen underestimate the pro-German elements. I am reliably informed that any day now there is going to be a fierce demonstration against our campaign by those who consider us anti-German. Your Grace will see the people of Vienna demonstrating in the streets. There is to be a protest against the appointment of Baron Wisniewski. Our friends Tutsi and Arnhem are assumed to be acting in collusion, while you, sir, are said to be working to undermine the German influence on the parallel campaign. Count Lonsdorff's eyes now reflected something between the impassivity of a frog's gaze and the irritability of a Hull's. Tutsi looked up slowly at Ulrich's face and gave him a warm, questioning look. Arnhem laughed heartily and stood up, trying to catch the section chief's eye with an urbane, humorous glance as a way of deprecating the absurd insinuation about the two of them. But as he could not connect with him he turned to Diotima instead. Tutsi had meanwhile taken Ulrich by the arm and asked where he had got his information. Ulrich told him it was no secret but a widely accepted rumor he had heard at a friend's house. Tutsi brought his face closer, forcing Ulrich to turn slightly aside from the others, and with this effect of privacy he suddenly whispered, "Don't you know yet why Arnheim is here? He is an intimate friend of Prince Musil and very much persona grata with the Tsar. He keeps in touch with Russia and is supposed to influence this campaign in a pacifist direction. Unofficially, of course, on His Russian Majesty's private initiative, as it were. A matter of ideology. Something for you, my friend," he concluded in a mocking tone. Unsdorf has no inkling of it. Section Chief Tutsi had this information through official channels. He believed it because he saw pacifism as a movement that was in keeping with the outlook a beautiful woman would have, which would explain Diotima's being so enraptured with Amim and Amim's spending more time in Tutsi's house than anywhere else. Before this he had come close to being jealous. He could believe in intellectual affinities up to a point, but he did not care to use devious methods to find out whether this point had been passed or not, so he had forced himself to go on trusting his wife. But while this was a victory of his manly self-respect over mere sexual instincts, these could still arouse enough jealousy in him to make him see for the first time that a professional man can never really keep an eye on his wife unless he is willing to neglect his work. Though he told himself that if an engine driver could not keep his woman with him on the job, a man at the controls of an empire could afford even less to be a jealous husband, it went against his character as a diplomat to settle for the noble ignorance in which this left him, and it undermined his professional self-assurance. So he was most thankful to be restored to his old self-confidence by this harmless explanation for everything that had worried him. There was even a little bonus in his feeling that it served his wife right that he knew all about Amim, while she saw only the human being and never dreamed that he was an agent of the Tsar. Now Tutsi again enjoyed asking her for little scraps of information, which he undertook to provide with a mixture of graciousness and impatience. He had worked out a whole series of seemingly harmless questions, the answers to which would enable him to draw his own conclusions. The husband would have been glad to take the cousin into his confidence, and was just wondering how to go about it without exposing his wife, when Count Unsdorf again took the lead in the conversation. He alone had remained seated, and nobody had noticed anything of the struggle going on inside him as the problems piled up. But his fighting spirit seemed to be restored. He twirled his Wallenstein moustache and said slowly and firmly, "Something will have to be done." "Have you come to a decision, Count?" they asked him. "I haven't been able to come up with anything," he said simply. "Still, something must be done." He sat there like a man who does not intend to move from the spot until his will is done. The effect was so powerful that everyone present felt the futile straining after an answer rattling inside him like a penny in a piggy bank that no amount of shaking will get out through the slot. Arnheim said, "Now, really, we can't let ourselves be influenced by that sort of thing." Unsdorf did not reply. The whole litany of proposals intended to give the parallel campaign some content was gone over again. Count Unsdorf reacted like a pendulum, always in a different position but always swinging the same way. "This can't be done because we have to think of the church. That can't be done, the free thinkers won't like it. The Association of Architects has already protested against this. There are qualms about that in the Department of Finance." So it went, on and on. Ulrich kept out of it. He felt as if the 5 persons taking their time to speak had just crystallized out of some impure liquid in which his senses had been marinated for months now. Whatever had he meant by telling Diotima that it was necessary to take control of the imaginary, or that other time, when he had said that reality should be abolished? Now she was sitting here, remembering such statements of his, and probably thinking all sorts of things about him. And what on earth had made him say to her that one should live like a character in a book? He felt certain that she had passed all that on to Amim by now. But he also felt sure that he knew what time it was, or the price of eggs, as well as anyone. If he nevertheless happened, just now, to hold a position halfway between his own and that of the others, it did not take some queer shape such as might result from a dim and absent state of mind. On the contrary, he again felt flooded by that illumination he had noticed earlier, in Bonadier's presence. He recalled going with the Tuzzies to a racecourse last fall, not so long ago, when there was an incident involving great, suspicious betting losses, and a peaceful crowd had in a matter of seconds turned into a turbulent sea of people pouring into the enclosure, not only smashing everything within reach but trifling the cash boxes as well, until the police succeeded in transforming them back into an assemblage of people out for a harmless and customary good time. In such a world it was absurd to think in terms of metaphors and the vague borderline shapes life might possibly, or impossibly, assume. Ulrich felt that there was nothing amiss with his perception of life as a crude and needy condition where it was better not to worry too much about tomorrow because it was hard enough to get through today. How could one fail to see that the human world is no hovering, insubstantial thing but craves the most concentrated solidity, for fear that anything out of the way might make it go utterly to pieces? Or, to take it a step further, how could a sound observer fail to recognize that this living compound of anxieties, instincts, and ideas, such as it is, though it uses ideas at most in order to justify itself, or as stimulants, gives those ideas their form and coherence, whatever defines them and sets them in motion? We may press the wine from the grapes, but how much more beautiful than a pool of wine is the sloping vineyard with its inedible rough soil and its endless rows of shining wooden stakes. In short, he reflected, The cosmos was generated not by a theory but he was about to say by violence, but a word he had not expected leapt to mind, and so he finished by thinking, but by violence and love, and the usual linkage between these two is wrong. At this moment violence and love again did not have quite their conventional meaning for Ulrich. Everything that inclined him toward nihilism and hardness was implied in the word violence. It meant whatever flowed from every kind of skeptical, factual, conscious behavior. A certain hard, cold aggressiveness had even entered into his choice of a career, so that an undercurrent of cruelty might have led to his becoming a mathematician. It was like the dense foliage of a tree hiding the trunk. And if we speak of love not merely in the usual sense but are moved by the word to long for a condition profoundly different, unto the very atoms that make up the body, from the poverty of lovelessness, or when we feel that we can lay claim to every quality as naturally as to none, or when it seems to us that what happens is only semblances prevailing, because life bursting with conceit over its here and now but really a most uncertain, even a downright unreal condition pours itself headlong into the few dozen cake molds of which reality consists, or that in all the orbits in which we keep revolving there is a piece missing, or that of all the systems we have set up, none has the secret of staying at rest. Then all these things, however different they look, are also bound up with each other like the branches of a tree, completely concealing the trunk on all sides. These two trees were the shape his life had taken, like a top-pronged fork. He could not say when it had entered into the sign of the tree with the hard, tangled brown quirk, but it had happened early on, for even his immature Napoleonic plans had shown him to be a man who looked on life as a problem he had set himself. Something it was his vocation to work out. This urge to attack life and master it had always been clearly discernible in him, whether it had manifested itself as a rejection of the existing order or as various forms of striving for a new one, as logical or moral needs or even merely as an urge to keep the body in fighting trim. And everything that, as time went on, he had called essayism, the sense of possibility, and imaginative in contrast with pedantic precision, his suggestions that history was something one had to invent, that one should live the history of ideas instead of the history of the world, that one should get a grip on whatever cannot quite be realized in practice and should perhaps end up trying to live as if one were a character in a book, figure with all the inessential elements left out, so that what was left would consolidate itself as some magical entity. All these different versions of his thinking, all in their extreme formulations against reality, had just one thing in common, an unmistakable, ruthless passion to influence reality. Harder to recognize because more shadowy and dreamlike were the ramifications of the other tree that formed an image for his life, rooted perhaps in some primal memory of a childlike relationship to the world, all trustfulness and yielding, which a middle dot had of done. A middle dot is a haunting sense of having once beheld the hoary vast earth in what normally only fills the flower pot in which the herbs of morality send up their stunted sprouts. No doubt that regrettably absurd affair of the Major's wife was his only attempt to reach a full development on this gentle shadow side of his life. It was also the beginning of a recoil that had never stopped. Since then, the leaves and twigs always drifting on the surface were the only sign that the tree still existed, though it had disappeared from view. This dormant half of his personality perhaps revealed itself most clearly in his instinctive assumption that the active and busy side of him was only standing in for the real self, an assumption that cast a shadow on his active self. In all he did involving physical passions as well as spiritual, he had always ended up feeling trapped in endless preparations that would never come to fruition in anything, so that as the years went by his life had lost any sense of its own necessity, just as lamp runs out of oil. His development had evidently split into two tracks, one running on the surface in daylight, the other in the dark below and closed to traffic, so that the state of moral arrest that had oppressed him for a long time, and perhaps more than was strictly necessary, might simply be the result of his failure to bring these two tracks together. Now, as he realized that this failure to achieve integration had lately been apparent to him in what he called the strained relationship between literature and reality, metaphor and truth, it flashed on Ulrich how much more all this signified than any random insight that turned up in one of those meandering conversations he had recently engaged in with the most inappropriate people. These two basic strategies, the figurative and the unequivocal, have been distinguishable ever since the beginnings of humanity. Single-mindedness is the law of all waking thought and action, as much present in a compelling logical conclusion as in the mind of the blackmailer who enforces his will on his victim step by step, and it arises from the exigencies of life where only the single-minded control of circumstances can avert disaster. Metaphor, by contrast, is like the image that fuses several meanings in a dream. It is the gliding logic of the soul, corresponding to the way things relate to each other in the intuitions of art and religion. But even what there is in life of common likes and dislikes, accord and rejection, admiration, subordination, leadership, imitation, and their opposites. The many ways man relates to himself and to nature, which are not yet and perhaps never will be purely objective, cannot be understood in other than metaphoric or figurative terms. No doubt what is called the higher humanism is only the effort to fuse together these two great halves of life, metaphor and truth, once they have been carefully distinguished from each other. But once one has distinguished everything in a metaphor that might be true from what is mere froth, one usually has gained a little truth, but at the cost of destroying the whole value of the metaphor. The extraction of the truth may have been an inescapable part of our intellectual evolution, but it has had the same effect of boiling down a liquid to thicken it, while the really vital juices and elements escape in a cloud of steam. It is often hard, nowadays, to avoid the impression that the concepts and the rules of the moral life are only metaphors that have been boiled to death, with the revolting greasy kitchen vapors of humanism billowing around the corpses, and if a digression is permissible at this point, it can only be this, that one consequence of this impression that vaguely hovers over everything is what our era should frankly call its reverence for all that is common. For when we lie nowadays, it is not so much a mighty of weaknesses out of a conviction that a man cannot prevail in life unless he is able to lie. We resort to violence because, after much long and futile talk, the simplicity of violence is an immense relief. People band together in organizations because obedience to orders enables them to do things they have long been incapable of doing out of personal conviction, and the hostility between organizations allows them to engage in the unending reciprocity of blood feuds, while love would all too soon put everyone to sleep. This has much less to do with the question of whether men are good or evil than with the fact that they have lost their sense of high and low. Another paradoxical result of this disorientation is the vulgar profusion of intellectual jewelry with which our mistrust of the intellect decks itself out. The coupling of a philosophy with activities that can absorb only a very small part of it, such as politics. The general obsession with turning every viewpoint into a standpoint and regarding every standpoint as a viewpoint, the need of every kind of fanatic to keep reiterating the one idea that has ever come his way, like an image multiplied to infinity in a hall of mirrors, all these widespread phenomena, far from signifying a movement toward humanism, as they wish to do, in fact represent its failure. All in all, it seems that what needs to be excised from human relations is the soul that finds itself misplaced in them. The moment Ulrich realized this, he felt that his life, if it had any meaning at all, demonstrated the presence of the two fundamental spheres of human existence in their separateness and in their way of working against each other. Clearly, people like himself were already being him, but they were isolated, and in his isolation he was incapable of bringing together again what had fallen apart. He had no illusions about the value of his philosophical experimentation, even if observed the strictest logical consistency in linking thought to thought. The effect was still one of piling one ladder upon another, so that the topmost rungs teetered far above the level of natural life. He contemplated this with revulsion. This could have been the reason he suddenly looked at Tutsi. Tutsi was speaking. As though his ear were receiving the first sounds of the morning, Ulrich heard him say, "I am in no position to judge whether our time is devoid of great human and artistic achievements as you say. I can only assure you that foreign policy is nowhere else so hard to determine as in this country of ours. It is fairly safe to predict that even in our great Jubilee year, French foreign policy will be motivated by the desire to settle scores and by colonialism. The English will be pushing their pawns to advantage on the world's chessboard, as their game has been characterized, and the Germans will be pursuing what they call, not always unambiguously, their place in the Sunday. But our old empire is so self-contained that it's anyone's guess in what direction we may be driven by circumstances." It was as though Tutsi were trying to put on the brakes, to utter a warning. That whiff of unintended irony came only from the naively factual tone in which he dryly presented to them his conviction that to want for nothing in this world was highly dangerous. The effect on Ulrich was to perk him up, as if he had been chewing on a coffee bean. Meanwhile Tutsi kept harping on his warning note, and he ended by saying, "Who can tack it upon himself, today, even to think of putting great political ideas into practice? It would take a criminal or a gambler courting bankruptcy. You surely wouldn't want that? The function of diplomacy is to keep what we have. Keeping what we have leads to war," Arnheim countered. "It may, I suppose," Tutsi conceded. "All one can do, probably, is to choose the most favorable moment for being led into it. Remembers our Alexander too? His father, Nicholas, was a despot, but he died a natural death. Alexander was a magnanimous ruler who began his reign by instituting sweeping liberal reforms, so that Russian liberalism turned into Russian radicalism, and Alexander survived 3 attempts to assassinate him, only to succumb to a 4th. Ulrich looked at Diotima. There she sat, upright, alert, serious, voluptuous, and corroborated her husband. "That's right. From what I have seen of the radical temper in our own discussions, I would say that if you give them an inch they'll take a mile." Tutsi smiled with a sense of having won a small victory over Arnheim. Arnheim looked impassive where he sat, his lips slightly parted, like a bud opening. Diotima, a silent tower of radiant flesh, gazed at him across the moat between them. The general polished his home-rimmed glasses. Ulrich spoke with care. "That's only because those who feel called upon to act, in order to restore some meaning to life, have one thing in common: they despise mere thinking just at the point where it could lead us to truths rather than simple personal opinions. Instead, where everything depends on pursuing those views to their inexhaustible wellspring, they opt for shortcuts and half-truths." Nobody spoke in answer. And why should anyone have answered him? What a man said was only words, after all. What mattered was that there were 6 people sitting in a room and having an important discussion. What they said or did not say in the course of it, their feelings, apprehensions, possibilities, were all included in this actuality without being on a level with it. They were included in the same way the dark movements of the liver and stomach are included in the actuality of a fully dressed person about to put his signature to an important document. This hierarchical order was not to be disturbed. This was reality itself. Ulrich's old friend Stumm had now finished filling his glasses. He put them on and looked at Ulrich. Even Ulrich had always assumed that he was only toying with these people, he suddenly felt quite forlorn among them. He remembered feeling something like it a few weeks or months before, a little puff of creation's breath asserting itself against the petrified lunar landscape where it had been exhaled. He thought that all the decisive moments of his life had been accompanied by such a sense of wonder and isolation. But was it anxiety that was troubling him this time? He could not quite pin his feeling down, but it suggested that he had never in his life come to a real decision, and that it was high time he did. This occurred to him not in so many words but only as an uneasy feeling, as though something were trying to tear him away from these people he was sitting with, and even though they meant nothing to him, his will suddenly clung to them, kicking and screaming. Count Lonsdorff was now reminded by the silence in the room of his duties as a political realist, and said in a rallying tone, "Well then, what's to be done? We must do something small, even if it's only temporary, to save our campaign from all those threats against it." This moved Ulrich to try something preposterous. "Your Grace," he said, "there is really only one real task for the parallel campaign, to make a start at taking stock of our general cultural situation. We must act more or less as if we expected the day of judgment to dawn in 1918, when the old spiritual books will be closed and a higher accounting set up. I suggest that you found, in His Majesty's name, a World Secretariat for Precision and Soul. Without that, all our other tasks cannot be solved, or else they are illusory tasks." He now added some of the things that had crossed his mind during the few minutes he had been lost in thought. As he spoke, it seemed to him not only that everybody's eyes were popping out of their sockets in sheer amazement, but also that their torsos were lifting up from their backsides. They had expected him to follow their host's example and come up with an anecdote, and when the joke failed to materialize he was left sitting there like a child surrounded by leaning towers that looked slightly offended at his silly game. Only Count Lonsdorff managed to put a good face on it. "Quite so," he said, though surprised. "Nevertheless, we are obliged now to go beyond mere suggestions and offer some concrete solution, and in that respect I must say that property and culture have left us badly stranded." Arnheim felt he must save the great nobleman from being taken in by Ulrich's jokes. "Our friend is caught up in an idea of his own," he explained. "He thinks it is possible to synthesize a right way to live, just like synthetic rubber or nitrogen. But the human mind," here he gave Ulrich his most chivalrous smile, "is sadly limited in being unable to breed its life forms as white mice are bred in the laboratory. On the contrary, it takes a huge granary to support no more than a few families of mice." He immediately apologized for indulging in square daring an analogy, but was in fact quite pleased with himself for coming up with something in the aristocratic Lonsdorff style of scientific large-scale land management, while so vividly illustrating the difference between ideas with and without the responsibility for carrying them out. But his Grace shook his head irritably. "I take his point quite well," he said. "People used to grow naturally into the conditions of their lives as they found them, and it was a sound way of coming into their own. But nowadays, with everything being shaken up as it is, everything uprooted from its natural soil, we will have to replace the traditional handicraft system, even in the raising of schools, as it were, by the intelligence of the factory." It was one of those remarkable statements his Grace occasionally voiced, to his own and everyone else's surprise, all the more so as he had merely been staring at Ulrich with a dumbfounded expression the whole time before he began to speak. "Still, everything our learned friend is saying is totally impracticable, just the same," Arnheim said firmly. "Oh, would you say so?" Count Lonsdorff said curtly, full of fighting spirit. Diotima now tried to make peace. "But, Count," she said, as if asking him for something one doesn't put into words, namely, to come to his senses. "We've long since tried everything my cousin says a middle dot. What else are these long, strenuous talks, such as the ones we had this evening, about, after all?" "Indeed?" The annoyed peer huffed. "I had an idea from the first that all these clever fellows won't get us anywhere. All of that psychoanalysis and relativity theory and whatever they call all that stuff is pure vanity. Every one of them is trying to make his own special blueprint of the world prevail over all the others. Let me tell you, even if our Herr Doctor did not express himself as well as he might have, he's basically quite right. People are always trying on something new whenever the times begin to change, and no good ever comes of it." The nervous strain caused by the abortive meanderings of the parallel campaign had now broken through to the surface. Count Lonsdorff had, without being aware of it, switched from twisting his moustache to fretfully twiddling his thumbs. Perhaps something else had also come to the S.J.Ufus, his dislike of Arnheim. While he had been astonished when Ulrich brought up the word soul, he was quite pleased with what followed. When a fellow like him bandies that word about, he thought, that's a lot of flim-flam. We don't need it from him, what else is religion for? But Arnheim, too, was upset. He had gone white to the lips. Up to now, Count Lonsdorff had spoken in that tone only to the general. Arnheim was not the sort of man to take it lying down. Still, he could not help being impressed with Count Lonsdorff's firmness in taking Ulrich's part, which painfully reminded him of his own divided feelings about Ulrich. He felt at a loss, because he had wanted to talk things out with Ulrich but had not found an opportunity to do so before this fortuitous clash in front of Alf the others, and so, instead of turning on Count Lonsdorff, whom he simply ignored, he addressed his words to Ulrich, with every sign of intense mental and physical agitation to a degree quite out of character for him. "Do you actually believe what you have just been saying?" he asked sternly, with no regard to considerations of civility. "Do you believe it can be done? Are you really of the opinion that it is possible to live in accordance with some analogy? If so, What would you do if his grace were to give you a free hand? Do tell me, I beg you. It was an awkward moment. Diotima was oddly enough reminded of a story she had read in the papers a few days before. A woman had received a merciless sentence for giving her lover an opportunity to murder her aged husband, who had not exercised his marital rights for years but would not agree to a separation. The case had caught Diotima's attention by its quasi-medical physical detail, and held it by a certain perverse fascination. It was also understandable that one was not inclined to blame any of the persons involved, limited as they were in their ability to help themselves. It was only some unnatural general state of affairs that gave rise to such situations. She had no idea what made her think of this case just at this moment. But she was also thinking that Ulrich had been talking to her lately about all sorts of things that were up in the air, and always ended up by annoying her with some outrageous suggestion of a personal kind. She had herself spoken of the soul emerging from its insubstantial state, in the case of a few privileged human beings. She decided that her cousin was just as unsure of himself as she was of herself, and perhaps just as passionate too. All of this was interwoven just now in her head or in her heart, that abandoned seat of the noble Lansdorfian amity with the story of the condemned woman, in a way that caused her to sit there with parted lips, feeling that something terrible would happen if Aimim and Ulrich were allowed to go on like this, but that it might be even worse if anyone interfered and tried to stop them. During Arnheim's attack on him, Ulrich had been looking at Tutsi. It cost Tutsi an effort to hide his eager curiosity in the brown furrows of his face. He was thinking that all these goings-on in his house were now coming to a head, propelled by their inherent contradictions. Nor had he any sympathy for Ulrich, whose line of talk went quite against Tutsi's grain. Convinced as he was that a man's worth lay in his will or in his work, and certainly not in his feelings or ideas, to talk such nonsense about mere figures of speech, he felt, was positively indecent. Ulrich might have been sensing some of this, because he remembered telling Tutsi that he would kill himself if the year he was taking off from his life were to pass without results. He had not said it in so many words but had made his meaning painfully clear, and he now felt ashamed of himself. Again he had the impression, without being able to account for it, that his moment of truth was at hand. Suddenly Gerda Fissel came to mind. There was a dangerous possibility of her coming to see him, to continue their last conversation. He realized that even as he had only been toying with her, they had already reached the limit of what words could do, and there was only one last step. He would have to fall in with the girl's unexpressed longings, ungird his intellectual loins, and breach her inner and parts. This was crazy. He would never have gone this far with Gerda had he not felt safe with her on this point. He was feeling a strangely sober, irritated exaltation, when he caught sight of Arnheim's angry face and heard himself accused of having no respect for reality, followed by the words "Forgive my saying so, but such a crass either, or as yours is really too juvenile." But he had lost the slightest inclination to answer any of T. He glanced at his watch and, with a smile of appeasement, said it had grown much too late for going on with the subject. In so saying he had regained his contact with the others. Section Chief Tutsia even stood up, and barely masked this discourtesy by pretending to do something or other. Count Lansdorf, too, had meanwhile calmed down. He would have been pleased to hear Ulrich put the Prussian in his place but did not mind his doing nothing about it. When you like a man, you like him, that's that, he thought, no matter how clever the other fellow's talk may be. And with a daring, though quite unconscious approach to Arnheim's idea of the mystery of the whole, he continued cheerfully, as he looked at Ulrich's expression, which was, at the moment, anything but intelligent. One might even say that a nice, likable person simply can't say or do anything really stupid. The party quickly broke up. The general slipped his handrooms into his pistol pocket. After having tried in vain to stick them into the bottom of his tunic, he had not yet found a proper place for this civilian instrument of wisdom. Here we have an armed truce of the intellect, he said to Tutsi, like a pleased accomplice, alluding to the speedy dispersal of the last guests. Only Count Lansdorf conscientiously held them all back for another moment. What is the consensus, then? And when no one found anything to say, he added peaceably, "Oh well, we shall see, we shall see." 117. A dark day for Rachel. Solomon's sexual awakening and his decision to seduce Rachel made him feel as cold-blooded as a hunter sighting game, or a butcher sharpening his knives for the slaughter, but he had no idea how to go about it and what, exactly, a successful seduction was. In short, the more he had a man's will, the more it made him feel the weakness of a boy. Rachel also had her sense of the inevitable next step, and ever since she had so self-forgetfully clung to Ulrich's hand, that evening of the incident with Bernadia, she was quite beside herself, afloat in a state of acute erotic distraction that was also raining flowers on Solomon, as it were. But conditions just then were not favorable and made for delays. The cook had taken sick, Rachel's time off had to be sacrificed. The heavy social schedule in the house was keeping her busy, and although Arnheim continued to visit Diotima often enough, it was as though they had decided that the two youngsters needed watching, for he seldom brought Solomon, and when he did, they saw each other only briefly, in the presence of their employers, with the proper blank and sullen looks on their face. At this time they almost learned to hate each other, because they made one another feel the misery of being kept on too short a leash. Solomon was also driven by his mountain ardor to violent escapades. He planned to slip away from the hotel at night unbeknownst to his master, So he stole a bedsheet, which he tried to cut up and twist into a rope ladder. When he made a mess of it, he threw the tortured bedsheet down a light shaft. Then for a long time he vainly studied ways and means to clamber up and do in a house front, using windowsills and the carved figures on the side, and on his daytime errands examined the city's fabled architecture solely for the hand and footholds it might offer a cat burglar. Meanwhile Rachel, who had been told of all these plans and setbacks in hasty whispers, would think that she saw the black full moon of his face on the pavement below, looking up at her, or that she heard his chirping call, to which she attempted a shy response, leaning far out her window into the empty night, until she had to admit that the night was indeed empty. She no longer regarded this romantic muddle as a nuisance but surrendered herself to it with a yearning wistfulness. The yearning was actually for Ulrich. Solomon was the man one didn't love but to whom one would give oneself nonetheless, as she never doubted. The fact that they had been kept apart lately, that they had hardly spoken to each other except in stolen whispers and were both in disfavor with their employers, had much the same effect on her as a night full of uncertainty, mystery, and sighs has on all lovers. It concentrated her fantasies like a burning glass, whose intense rays felt less as a pleasant warmth than as a heat one cannot stand much longer. In this regard, Rachel, who did not waste any time fantasizing about rope ladders and climbing walls, was the more practical-minded. The nebulous dream of an elopement soon dwindled to a plan for a single night together, and when this could not be arranged, a stolen quarter of an hour would have to do. After all, neither Dietermann nor Count Unsdorf nor Anheim_:_ staying on together for another hour or two after some crowded and unproductive meeting with the best minds in town, while they all worried about the progress of their business, without need of further attentions from their staff, ever considered that such an hour at liberty consists of 4 quarter hours. But Rachel had thought about it, and since the cook was still not quite recovered and had permission to retire early, the young maid was so overburdened that there was no telling where she might be at any given time, even as she was spared much of her regular duty as a parlour maid. Experimentally, more or less as a person afraid of committing suicide outright will go on making half-hearted attempts until one of them succeeds. By mistake she had smuggled Solomon into her room several times already, always prepared with some story of having been on duty if he was caught, while hinting to him that there were other ways to her bedroom than climbing the walls. So far, however, the young lovers had not gone beyond yawning together in the front hall while spying out the situation, until one evening, when the voices inside the meeting room had been heard endlessly responding to each other, monotonous as the sounds of threshing. Solomon used a lovely expression he had read in a novel and said that he could stand it no longer. Even inside her little room it was he who bolted the door, but then they did not dare turn on the light but stood there blindly facing each other as though the loss of sight had deprived them of all their other senses as well, like two statues in the park at night. Solomon naturally thought of pressing Rachel's hand or pinching her leg to make her shriek, his way of conducting his male conquest of her thus far, but he had to refrain from causing any noise, and when at last he made some clumsy pass at her, there was only Rachel's impatient indifference in response. For Rachel felt the hand of fate on her spine, pushing her ahead, and her nose and forehead were ice cold, as though she had already been drained of all her illusions. It made Solomon feel quite at a loss too. He was all thumbs, and there was no telling how long it would take them to break the deadlock of their rigid posture face to face in the dark. In the end, it had to be the civilized and more experienced Rachel who took the part of seducer. What helped her was the resentment she now felt in place of her former love for Dietermann. Ever since she had ceased to be content to enjoy vicariously her mistress's exaltations and was involved in her own love affair, she had greatly changed. She not only told lies to cover up her encounters with Solomon, she even pulled Dietermann's hair when she combed it, to revenge herself for the vigilance with which her innocence was being guarded. But what enraged her most was something in which she had formerly delighted, having to wear Dietermann's cast-off chemises, panties, and stockings, for even though she cut these things down to a third of their former size and remodeled them, she felt imprisoned in them, as though wearing the yoke of propriety on her bare body. But this lingerie now gave her the inspiration she needed in this situation. For she had told Solomon earlier about the changes she had been noticing for some time in her mistress's underthings, and now she could break their deadlock by simply showing him. "Here, you can see for yourself what they're really up to," she said in the darkness, showing Solomon the moonbeam frill of her little panties. "And if they're carrying on together like this, then they're certainly also making a fool of the master-abouts that war they're cooking up in our house." And as the boy gingerly fingered the fine-textured and dangerous panties, she added somewhat breathlessly, "I bet that your pants are as black as you are, Solomon, that's what they're all saying." Now Solomon vengefully but gently dug his nails into her thigh, and Rachel had to move closer to free herself, and had to do and say one thing and another, all of which produced no real result, until she finally used her sharp little teeth on Solomon's face, which was pressed childishly against her own and at every movement she made kept on clumsily getting itself in the way, as if it were a large apple. At which point she forgot to feel embarrassed at what she was doing. And Solomon forgot to feel self-conscious, and love raged like a storm through the darkness. When it was over, it dropped the lovers with a thud, vanished through the halls, and the darkness between them was like a lump of coal with which the sinners had blackened themselves. They had lost track of time, overestimated the time they had taken, and were afraid. Rachel's half-hearted final kiss was a mere annoyance to Solomon. He wanted the light switched on, and behaved like a burglar who has his loot and is now wholly intent upon making his getaway. Rachel, who had quickly and shamefacedly straightened her clothes, gave him a look that was fathomless and aimless at once. Her tousled hair hung down over her eyes, and behind them she saw again all the great images of her ideal self, forgotten until this moment. Her fantasies had been filled with her wish not only for every possible desirable trait in herself but also for a handsome, rich, and exciting lover, and now here in front of her stood Solomon, still half undressed, looking hopelessly ugly, and she didn't believe a single word of all the stories he had told her. She might have liked to take advantage of the dark to cradle his tense, plump face in her arms a little while longer before they let go of each other. But now that the light was on, he was only her new lover, 1,000 possibilities shrunken into one somewhat ludicrous little wretch, whose existence excluded all others. And Rachel herself was back to being a servant girl who had let herself be seduced and was now beginning to be terrified of having a baby, which would bring it all to light. She was simply too crushed by this transformation even to give a sigh. She helped Solomon to finish dressing, for in his confusion the boy had flung off his tight little jacket with all those buttons, but she was helping him not out of tenderness but only so that they could hurry downstairs. She had paid far more than it was worth, and to be caught out now would be the last straw. All the same, when they had finished, Solomon turned round and flashed her a dazzling smile that turned into a whinny of self-satisfaction. Rachel quickly picked up a box of matches, turned out the light, softly drew the bolt, and whispered, before opening the door, "You must give me one more kiss." For that was the right way to do things, but it tasted to both of them like tooth powder on their lips. Back down in the front hall, they were amazed to find they still had time. The voices on the other side of the door were running on as before. By the time the guests were dispersing, Solomon had disappeared, and half an hour later Rachel was combing her mistress's hair with great attentiveness and almost with her former humble devotion. "I am glad that my little lecture seems to have done you some good," Diotima said with approval, and this woman who in so many ways never quite achieved any real satisfaction kindly patted her little maid's hand. 118. So kill him. Walter had changed out of his office suit into a better one and was knotting his tie at Clarissa's dresser mirror, which despite its irregularly curving Art Nouveau frame showed a shallow, distorted image in its cheap glass. "They are absolutely right," he said gleefully. "The famous campaign is nothing but a fake." "But what's the point of marching and screaming?" Clarissa said. "What's the point of anything these days? Marching together, at least they're forming a procession, feeling each other's physical presence. And at least they're not thinking, and at least they're not writing, something may come of it." "Do you really think the campaign is worth all that indignation?" Walter shrugged his shoulders. "Haven't you read that resolution by the German faction in the paper? Haranguing the Prime Minister about defamation and unfairness to the German population, so on? A middle dot and the sneering proclamation of the Czech League? Or the little item about the Polish delegates returning to their voting districts? For anyone who can read between the lines, that one's the most revealing story, because so much depends on the polls, and now they've left the government in the lurch. This was no time to provoke everyone by coming out with this patriotic campaign. This morning in town, Clarissa said, I saw mounted police go by, a whole regiment of them. A woman said they're being kept in reserve somewhere. Of course. There are troops standing by in the barracks too. Do you suppose there'll be trouble? Who can tell? Will they run the people down? How awful, all those horses' bodies jammed in among the people. Walter had undone his tie and was reknotting it all over again. Have you ever been mixed up in anything of this kind? Clarissa one asked. As a student. Never since then? Walter shook his head. Didn't you say just now that if there's trouble, it will all be Ulrich less than HS fault? I said nothing of the kind, Walter protested. He takes no interest at all in politics, unfortunately. All I said was that it's just like him to start up something of this sort. He's involved with the people who are pen A middle dot responsible for all this. A middle dot TD like to come into town with you, Clarissa announced. That's out of the question. It would upset you too much. Walter spoke with great firmness. He had heard all sorts of things in the awful less than A middle dot T about what might happen at the demonstration, and he wanted to K less than A middle dot tip Clarissa away from it. It wouldn't do at all to expose her to the hysteria of a large crowd. Clarissa had to be treated with care, like a pregnant woman. He almost got a lump in his throat at the word pregnant, even though he did not actually pronounce it, so unexpectedly had it come to mind, warming him with the thought of motherhood, however foolishly, considering his wife's ill-tempered refusal of herself. Well, life is full of such contradictions, he told himself, not without some pride, and offered, "Till stay home, if you'd rather." "No," she said. "You should be there, at least." She wanted to be left to herself. When Walter had told her of the upcoming demonstration and described what it would be like, it had made her think of a huge serpent covered with scales, each in separate motion, and she had wanted to see this for herself, but without the fuss of a long argument about it. Walter put his arm around her. "I'll stay home too?" he repeated, in a questioning tone. She brushed his arm off, took a book from the shelf, and ignored him. It was a volume of Nietzsche. But instead of going, Walter pleaded, "Let me see what you're up to." The afternoon was ending. A vague foretaste of spring made itself felt in the house, like bird song muted by walls and glass. An illusory scent of flowers rose from the varnish on the floor. the upholstery, the polished brass doorknobs. Walter held out his hand for her book. Clarisse clutched it with two hands, one finger between the pages where she had opened it. And now they had one of their terrible scenes, of which this marriage had seen so many. They were all on the same pattern. Imagine a theatre with the stage blacked out, and the lights going on in two boxes on opposite sides of the proscenium, with Walter in one of them and Clarisse in the other, singled out among all the men and women, and between them the deep black abyss, warm with the bodies of invisible human beings. Now Clarisse opens her lips and speaks, and Walter replies, and the whole audience listens in breathless suspense, for never before has human talent produced such a spectacle of Sonnet Lumia, Sturm und Drang. Such was the scene, once more, with Walter stretching out his arm, imploring her, and Clarisse, a few steps or 11 away from him, with her finger wedged between the pages of her book opening it at random. She had hit on that fine passage where the master speaks of the impoverishment that follows the decay of the will and manifests itself in every form of life as a proliferation of detail at the expense of the whole. Life driven back into the most minute forms, leaving the rest devitalized, was what she remembered, though she had only a vague sense of the general drift of the context over which she had run her eye before Walter had again interrupted her, and yet, despite the unfavorable circumstances, she had made a great discovery. For although in this passage the master spoke of all the arts, and even of all the forms taken by human life, his examples were all literary ones, and since Clarisse did not understand generalizations, she saw that Nietzsche had not grasped the full implication of his own ideas, for they applied to music as well. She could hear her husband's morbid piano playing as though he were actually playing there beside her. His exaggerated pauses, chokes with emotion. The halting way his notes came from under his fingertips when his thoughts were straying toward her, and when, to use another of the master's expressions, the secondary moral element overwhelmed the artist in him. Clarisse had come to recognize the sound Walter made when he was full of unuttered desire for her, and she could see the music draining out of his face, leaving only his lips shining, so that he looked as though he had cut his finger and was about to faint. This was how he looked now, with that nervous smile as he held his arm stretched out toward her. Nietzsche, of course, could not have known any of this, and yet it was like a sign that she had been led to open the book, by chance, at a place less than touching on this very thing, and as she suddenly saw, heard, and grasped it all, she was struck by the lightning flash of inspiration where she stood, on a high mountain called Nietzsche, which had buried Walter although it reached no higher than the soles of her feet. The practical philosophy and poetry of most people, who are neither originators nor on the other hand unsusceptible to ideas, consists of just such shimmering fusions of someone else's great thought with their own small private modifications. Walter had meanwhile stood and was coming toward Clarisse. He had decided to forget the demonstration he had intended to join and stay home with her. He saw her leaning back against the wall in repugnance as he approached her, yet this deliberate gesture of a woman shrinking from a man unfortunately did not infect him with the same abhorrence, but only aroused in him those male urges that might have been precisely what she shrank from. For a man must be capable of taking charge and of imposing his will on whoever resists him, and the need to prove his manhood suddenly meant just as much to Walter as the need to fight off the last shreds of his youthful superstition that a man must amount to something special. One doesn't have to be something special, he thought defiantly. It was somehow cowardly not to be able to get along without that illusion. We are all inclined to excesses, he thought dismissively. We all have something morbid, some horror, withdrawal, malevolence, in our makeup. Each one of us could do something that could do, but what of it? He resented the mania for fostering the extraordinary in oneself instead of reabsorbing those all too corruptible outgrowths and, by assimilating them organically, injecting some new life into the bloodstream of the civilization, which was far too inclined to grow sluggish. So he thought now, and he was looking forward to the day when music and painting would no longer mean anything more to him than a refined form of amusement. Wanting a child was part of this new sense of mission. The dominant desire of his youth to become a Titan, a new Prometheus, had ended in his coming to believe, somewhat over-emphatically, that one must first become like everyone else. He was now ashamed of having no children. He would have liked at least 5, if Clarisse and his income had permitted it, so that he could be the center of a warm circle of life. He wanted to surpass in mediocrity that great mediocre mass of humanity which transmits life itself, paradoxical as his desire was. But whether he had taken too long to think, or had slept too late. Before starting to dress and beginning this conversation, his cheeks were glowing now, and Clarisse showed that she instantly understood why he was moving closer to her book, and this fine attunement to each other's moods, despite the painful signs of her aversion to him, immediately subdued the brat in him and broke down the simplicity of his impulse. "Why won't you show me what you're reading? Can't we just talk?" he pleaded, intimidated. "We can't just talk," Clarisse hissed at him. "You're hysterical," Walter exclaimed. He tried to get the book, open as it was, away from her. She stubbornly clung to it. After they had been wrestling over it silently for a while, Walter started wondering, what on earth do I want the book for? And let go. At this point the incident would have been closed if Clarisse had not, at the very moment she was released, pressed herself up against the wall even more fiercely than before, as though she had to force her body backward through a stiff hedge to escape some threat of violence. She was fighting for breath, her face white, and hoarsely screamed, "Instead of amounting to something yourself, you just want to make a child to do it for you." Her lips spat these words at him venomously, and all Walter could do was gasp his "let's talk" at her again. "I won't talk, you make me sick," Clarissa answered, suddenly in full possession of her voice again, and using it with such sharpness that it crashed like heavy china to the floor, midway between them. Walter took a step backward and stared at her in amazement. Clarissa did not really mean it. She was merely afraid of giving in, from good nature or a recklessness, and letting Walter bind her to him with swaddling bands, which must not happen, not now when she was ready to settle the whole question once and for all. The situation had come to a head. She thought of this term, heavily underlined. It was the one Walter had used to explain why the populace was demonstrating in the streets, for Ulrich, who was linked to Nietzsche by dint of having given her the philosopher's works as a wedding present, was on the other side of the conflict, the side against which this spearhead would be directed, if there was trouble. Now Nietzsche had just given her a sign, and if she was standing on a high mountain. What was a high mountain other than the earth coming to a point to a head? The way things were interrelated was truly amazing, like a code that hardly anyone could decipher. Even Clarissa didn't have too clear a perception of it, but that was just why she needed to be alone and had to get Walter out of the house. The wild hatred that flared up in her face at this point in her thoughts was an expression of a physical rage in which she as a person was only vaguely involved, a kind of pianist's furioso such as Walter also had at his fingertips, so that he too, after having stared at his wife in bewilderment, suddenly went white in the face, bared his teeth, and, responding to the loathing of him she had expressed, shouted, "Beware of genius. You in particular, just watch out." He was screaming even louder than she had been, and his dark prophecy, which had burst from his throat with a force beyond any he knew himself to have, so horrified him that everything turned black as though there had been an eclipse of the sun. Clarissa was in shock, too, and struck dumb by it. An emotion with the impact of a solar eclipse is certainly no trifle, and whatever had brought it on, at the heart of it was the quite unexpected explosion of Walter's jealousy of Ulrich. Why was he driven to call Ulrich a genius? All he had meant was hubris, the pride that comes before the fall. Images from the past came to his inner eye, Ulrich returning home in uniform, that barbarian who had already been carrying on with real women when Walter, who was the older, was still writing poems to statues in the park. Later on, Ulrich the engineer bringing home the latest reports on the exact sciences. The world of precision, speed, steel. For Walter, the humanist, it was another invasion by the Mongol horde. With his younger friend, Walter had always felt the obscure uneasiness of being the weaker man, both physically and in initiative, although he had seen himself as the life of the mind incarnate while the other stood merely for raw will. Wasn't Walter always being moved by the beautiful or the good, while Ulrich stood by shaking his head? Such impressions leave their mark, they confirm and define the relationship. Had Walter succeeded in seeing that passage in the book for which he had wrestled with Clarissa, he would certainly not have understood it as she did. To her the decadence Nietzsche described as driving the will to life away from the whole and into the realm of detail fitted Walter's tendency to brood over the problems of the artist, while Walter would have seen it as an excellent characterization of his friend Ulrich, beginning with his overestimation of facts, in accord with the modem superstition of empiricism, which led directly to the barbaric fragmentation of the very self that was what made Ulrich a man without qualities, or qualities without a man, according to Walter's diagnosis, which Ulrich, in his megalomania, had had the gall to accept wholeheartedly. It was this that Walter had meant by denouncing Ulrich as a genius, for if anyone was entitled to call himself a solitary original it was Walter himself, and yet he had given this up in order to rejoin the rest of the human race in fulfilling its shared mission. In this he was a whole generation ahead of his friend. But as Clarissa did not utter a sound in answer to his violent outburst, he was thinking, if she says one word in his favor now, I couldn't stand it. And he shook with hatred, as though it were Ulrich's arm shaking him. In his fury he imagined himself snatching up his hat and dashing out the door to rush blindly through the streets, the houses bending in the wind as he ran. Only after a while did he slow down and look into the faces of the people he was passing. As they met his stare in a friendly fashion, he began to calm down. At this point he tried, to the extent his consciousness had not been swallowed up altogether by his fantasy, to explain himself to Clarissa. But his words only shone in his eyes instead of coming from his lips. How was a man to describe the joy of being with his own kind, with his brothers? Clarissa would say he was not enough of an individual. But there was something inhuman about Clarissa's towering self-confidence, and he had enough of trying to live up to its arrogant demands. He ached to take refuge with her within some broader human order, instead of this lonely drifting in a boundless delusion of love and personal anarchy. Underneath everything one isn't do tilde, and even when one happens to be in opposition to one's fellow man, one needs to feel that one is basically moving toward union with them was more or less what he would have liked to say to her now. For Walter had always been lucky in getting along with people, even in the midst of an argument they felt his attraction, and he theirs, and so the somewhat banal notion that there is, inherent in the human community, something that keeps things in balance, that rewards soundness and always comes through in the end, had become a solid conviction in his life. The example came to mind of the kind of person who could make birds come flying to him of their own accord, and who often had a rather bird-like look about them. For every human being there was some animal mysteriously akin to him, he felt. It was a theory he had once worked out for himself, though not scientifically. He believed that musical people are intuitively aware of a great deal that is beyond the ken of science, and from childhood on, Walter's animal kinship had undoubtedly been with fish. Fish had always held a powerful attraction for him, though mixed with dread, and at the start of his school vacations he always acted as if possessed. He would stand for hours at the water's edge angling for fish, pulling them out of their element and laying their corpses beside him on the grass, until it all ended with a fit of revulsion close to panic. Fish in the kitchen, too, were among his earliest passions. There the bones from the filleted fish were put into a boat-shaped receptacle, glazed green and white, like grass and clouds, and half full of water, where, for some reassuring having to do with the laws of the kitchen, the fish skeletons were kept until after the meal had been prepared, when the fish bones went into the garbage. This dish drew the boy like a magnet. He would always find childish excuses for hovering over it for hours at a time, and when anyone asked him outright what he was doing there, he was struck dumb. When he thought about it now, the answer that occurred to him was that the magic of fish lay in their belonging wholly to one element, never to more than one. Again he saw them as he had often seen them in the deep mirror of the water, moving not as he did both on the earth and within a second, intangible element, and at home in neither the one nor the other. Walter thought, spinning out the image this way and that, one belongs to the earth, with which one shares no more than the bare space occupied by the soles of one's feet. The rest of one's body is upright in air that it merely displaces, that gives no support but lets one fall. The fish is ground, their air, food, and drink, their recoil from enemies as well as their shadowy advances in love and their grave, were all one, wholly enclosing them. They moved within the element that moved them, something a human being can experience only in a dream or in a longing to return to the sheltering tenderness of the womb. The belief in this universal longing was just coming into fashion. But in that case, why did he rip the fish from their element and kill them? Why did he get such an unutterable, awesome thrill out of that? Well, he did not want to know the answer. He, Walter, could admit that he was an enigma. But Clarisse had once said that fish were the aquatic bourgeoisie. Walter winced at this insult. As he kept hastening through the streets in his ongoing fantasy, looking into the faces of the passers-by, it was turning into good fishing weather, not actually raining, but some moisture was coming down, and the streets, as he now saw for the first time, had already been darkly glistening for a while. The men were all dressed in black, with bowler hats but no collars and ties, which did not surprise him, as they were not middle class but were evidently coming from factory, walking in easy groupings, while others, who had not yet finished their day's work, were hastily pushing through these clusters, just as Walter himself was doing, and it all made him feel very happy, except for those bare necks that reminded him of something troubling and not quite right. Suddenly the rain came pouring down, the people scattered and ran as something came slashing through the air, a flash of white, fish raining down, and then a trembling, tender single voice that seemed to have nothing to do with anything called a little dog by name. These last images were so independent of him that they took him entirely by surprise. He had not been aware that his thoughts had gone dreaming on their own, drifting along with incredible speed on the flood of images. He raised his eyes and found himself staring into his young wife *sa middle dot face, which was still twisted with dislike. He felt deeply unsure of himself, remembered that he had been about to register a complaint, in detail and at length. His mouth was still open. But he had no idea whether minutes had passed since then, or seconds, or only milliseconds. Yet he also felt a warmth of pride, as after an ice-cold bath an ambiguous shuddering of the skin signalizes more or less, look at me, see what I can stand. There was shame as well at such an eruption of buried feeling, when he had been on the point of praising everything that knows its place, keeps a tight train on itself, and is content with its modest part as a link in the great scheme of things, as being far superior to the deviant, and here his innermost convictions lay prone with their roots up in the air, mired in life's volcanic mud. Mainly he felt terrified, sure that something horrible was about to befall him. This fear had no rational basis. He was still thinking in images and was obsessed with the notion that Clarisse and Ulrich were intent on tearing him out of his picture. He made an effort to shake off his waking dream and find something to say that would pull the conversation which his loss of control had brought to a standstill back onto a sensible track, and actually had something on the tip of his tongue, but a suspicion that his words came too late, that meanwhile something else had been said and done without his being aware of it, restrained him. And then, in the midst of catching up with the time lapse, he suddenly heard Clarisse saying to him, if you want to kill Ulrich, why don't you? You're a slave of conscience. An artist can't make good music when he's saddled with a conscience. It took a long time for this to sink in. Some things are soonest understood by means of one's own answer to them, but Walter was holding back his answer for fear of betraying his absence of mind. And in this moment of indecision he understood, or let himself be persuaded, that Clarisse had actually put into words the source of the terrifying fugue of ideas he had just been through. She was right. If Walter could have had his wish, it would often have been none other than to see Ulrich dead. That sort of thing is not too uncommon in a friendship, which does not dissolve as easily as love, when there is something in it that threatens a person's self-esteem. Nor was the real murder in his heart, for the Montfontaine imagined Ulrich dead. His old boyhood love for his lost friend instantly revived, at least in part, and just as in the theatre the civilized inhibition against a monstrous act is temporarily suspended by some pumped-up emotion, Walter almost felt that the thought of a tragic solution ennobled even the intended victim. He felt rather uplifted, despite his physical timidity and his squeamishness at the thought of seeing blood. He would have liked to see Ulrich's arrogance broken down. He would have done nothing toward bringing even this about. But thoughts are not logical by nature, however much we like to think they are. Only the unimaginative resistance of reality alerts us to the paradoxes inherent in the poem called man. So perhaps Clarisse was right in saying that too much of a civilized conscience got in an artist's way. All of this was going through Walter's head as he faced his wife with a baffled, reluctant expression. If he hampers you in your work, Clarisse repeated with zeal, then you have the right to get him out of the way. She seemed to offer this as a stimulating and entertaining idea. Walter wanted to hold out his hands to her, and although his arms felt pinned to his sides, he seemed to have come closer to her. Nietzsche and Christ only failed because they were half-hearted in the end, she whispered in his ear. What awful nonsense she was talking. How could she drag Christ into this? What was that supposed to mean that Christ failed because he was half-hearted? Such analogies were merely embarrassing. And yet Walter felt an indescribable prompting issuing from those moving lips of hers. Evidently his own hard-won resolution to make common cause with the majority was being steadily undermined by the irrepressible need to be someone in his own right. He laid hands on Clarisse and held her fast with all his strength, so that she could not move. Her eyes met his like two tiny discs. How can you let such ideas enter your head? He said, over and over, but got no answer. He must have unconsciously drawn her closer to him, for Clarisse now set the nails of her outspread 10 fingers on his face like a bird's claws, keeping it from getting any closer to hers. She's crazy, Walter felt, but he couldn't let her go. An ugliness beyond all comprehension distorted her face. He had never seen a lunatic in his life, but this, he thought, must be what they looked like. And suddenly he groaned, "You're in love with him." It was not a particularly original remark, nor was this the first time they had argued the point. It was only that he did not want to believe that Clarisse was mad but preferred to believe that she loved Ulrich. This act of self-sacrifice was perhaps not quite uninfluenced by the fact that Clarisse, whose thin-lipped early Renaissance beauty he had always admired, now for the first time looked ugly to him, an ugliness possibly related to her face being no longer tenderly veiled by love for him but stripped bare by the brutal love for his rival. Here was a sufficiency of complications, trembling between his heart and his eye as something quite new to him, full of meaning both general and personal. But what if his groaning out "You're in love with him" in that subhuman voice was a sign of his being already infected by Clarisse's madness? The thought gave him a start. Clarisse had gently freed herself from his grasp but then moved close to him of her own accord and said several times, in answer to his question, as though she were chanting something, "I don't want a child from you. I don't want a child from you," kissing him lightly and quickly as she spoke. Then she was gone. Had she really also said, "He wants a child from me"? Walter could not be sure, but he heard it as a sort of possibility. He stood at the piano, jealous to the bursting point, sensing a breath of something warm and something cold blowing on him from either side. Were these the currents of genius and madness? Of surrender and of hatred? Of love and rationality? He could imagine himself leaving the way open for Clarisse and off laying his heart down on the road for her to walk over, and he could also imagine himself annihilating her and Ulrich with the power of words. He could not decide whether to rush off to Ulrich or begin composing his symphony, which might in this moment become the eternal struggle between the earth and the stars, or whether it might be a good idea to cool himself off first in the water-nymph pool of Wagner's forbidden music. By dint of these considerations, the indescribable state in which he had found himself began to clear up. He opened the piano and lit a cigarette, and while his thoughts were scattering farther afield, his fingers on the keyboard were beginning to play the billowing, spine-melting music of the Saxon wizard. After this slow discharge of emotion had been going on for a while, he came to realize that he and his wife had both been in a state in which they could not be held responsible for their actions, embarrassing as it was. He knew it was too soon to go after Clarisse and make her understand. Now he needed to be with other people. He clapped on his hat and went off to town to carry out his original intention and immerse himself in the general excitement, if he could find it. As he walked he felt as though he were a captain bringing with him a demonic fighting force to link up with the others. But once he was on the trolley to town, life resumed its ordinary appearance. That Ulrich would have to be among the opposing forces, that Count Lunsdorf's townhouse might be stormed by the marchers, that he might see Ulrich hanging from a street lamp or being trampled by an onrushing mob or, alternatively, being defended by Walter and brought, trembling, to safety. These possibilities were at most fleeting shadows on the bright daylight pattern of the orderly train ride, with its set ticket prices, regular stops, and warning bells, a pattern with which Walter, his breathing now restored to a calmer rhythm, felt so much at home. 119. A countermine and a seduction. It now looked as though things were coming to a head, and even for Director Leo Musil, who had been patiently biding his time and laying his countermine against a moment of satisfaction came. Too bad that Frau Clementine happened to be out, so that he had to content himself with walking into his daughter Gerda's room, in his hand the afternoon paper that usually carried the latest news of the stock exchange. He settled himself comfortably in a chair, pointed to an item on the page, and asked genially, "Well now, my child, do you know to what we are indebted for the presence of that highbrow financier among us?" At home he never referred to Arnheim in any other terms, to show that as a middle-serious man of business he was not impressed by his womenfolk's admiration for this rich windbagger. Hatred may not give a man second sight, but there's often a grain of truth in a stock exchange rumor, and the hint of one in the news item, combined with Fissel's dislike of the man, instantly made him see the whole picture. Well, my dear, do you? He repeated, trying to catch his daughter's eye and hold it in the triumphant beam of his own. He wants to get control of the Gallus oil fields, that's what. With this Musil got up again, grabbed his paper as one might grab a dog by the scruff of his neck, and walked out, because it had just occurred to him that there were several men he might con to check his information. He felt as though what he had just learned from the paper was what he had been thinking all along, which shows that news from the stock exchange has quite the same effect as the higher forms of literature, and he now approved of Arnheim as a sensible man of whom nothing less should have been expected. Quite forgetting that he had till then been calling him nothing but a windbag. He could not be bothered to elucidate to Gerda the meaning of his announcement. Every further W road would only have weakened the impact of the facts, which spoke so eloquently for themselves. He wants control of the Gallus oil fields. With the weight of this blunt statement on his tongue, he left the scene, thinking only, the man who can afford to play a waiting game always wins in the end. This is axiomatic on the stock exchange, among other such truths, which most perfectly complement the eternal verities. Gerda waited until he was out of her room to give vent to high feelings she would not give her father the satisfaction of seeing her disconcerted or even surprised, but now she hastily flung open the closet, grabbed her hat and coat, and straightened her hair and dress at the mirror, where she sat still for a bit, doubtfully studying her face. She had decided to rush directly to Ulrich with her Efther's disclosure, which she thought Ulrich of all people should hear as soon as possible, since she knew enough about what was going on in Diotima's circle to realize its importance to him. She sensed a world of feeling coming into motion, like a crowd that has been hesitating on the brink of something for a long time. Up to this point she had forced herself to behave as if she had forgotten Ulrich's invitation, but her first impulses had no sooner begun to detach themselves from the dark mass of feeling and slowly to move forward, and the ones farther back were irresistibly impelled to run and push forward, and while she hesitated to make up her mind made itself up without paying any attention to her. He doesn't love Mel, she told herself while studying her face, grown even more haggard in the last few days, in the mirror. How could he love me, when I look like this, she thought listlessly, and added at once, in defiance, he's not worth it, it's all in my imagination anyway. She sat there in utter discouragement, feeling drained, feeling also that for years they had both worked hard at complicating something that was basically quite simple. Meanwhile Hans was only adding to her nervous strain with his immature attempts at making love to her. She treated him harshly and sometimes, of late, contemptuously, which only made Hans more violent, behaving like a boy who threatens to do himself in, and when she had to calm him down, he fell back to putting his arms around her and touching her in his vague way, so that her shoulders grew bony and her skin turned dull. All these torments she had put behind her when she opened her closet to take out her hat, and her anxiety in front of the mirror only led to her jumping up again and rushing out, without in the least getting rid of the anxiety itself. When Ulrich saw her coming in, saw everything. To top it off, she had even tied on a veil such as Bernadette wore to visit him. Gerda was trembling in every limb and tried to mask her condition by assuming an unnaturally casual manner, which only made her seem absurdly stiff. The reason I came, Ulrich, is that I've just had some important information from my father. How peculiar, Ulrich thought, she's never called me by my first name before. Her forced tone of intimacy infuriated him, but he tried to keep her from seeing this by attributing her theatrical behavior to her wish to make her visit look less portentous, more like a normal, if slightly belated, occurrence, though the effort it cost her was bound to have the opposite effect on him, suggesting that her intentions were clearly to go to the limit. We've been close friends for a long time, she explained, and the only reason we never used first names was to avoid the implications. It was a rehearsed entrance, and she was prepared to surprise him with it. But Ulrich cut it short by putting an arm around her and giving her a kiss. Gerda gave way like a melting candle. Her breathing, her fingers fumbling for him, were those of a person who has lost consciousness. He was instantly moved to behave with the ruthlessness of a seducer who senses the vacillation of a soul being dragged along by its body like a prisoner in the grip of his captors. The windows, a faint glimmer of wintry afternoon light entered the darkening room, where he stood outlined against one of these bright rectangles with the girl in his arms. Her head was yellow and sharply contoured against the soft pillow of light, and her complexion hid an oily shine, so that the whole effect was corpse-like. He had to overcome a slight revulsion as he kissed her slowly everywhere on her bare skin between her hair and her neckline until he came to her lips, which met his in a manner reminiscent of the frail little arms a child puts around a grown-up's neck. He thought of Bernadette's beautiful face, which, in the grip of passion, resembled a dove with its feathers ruffled in the claws of a bird of prey, and of Diotima's statuesque loveliness, which he had never enjoyed. How strange that instead of the beauty these two women had to offer he should be looking at Gerda's smiling face, grim with passion. But Gerda did not remain in her waking swoon for long. She had meant to shut her eyes for only a fleeting moment but lost all sense of time while Ulrich was kissing her, as if the stars were standing still in the infinite. As soon as he began to pause in his labors, however, she awakened and got firmly to her feet again. These were the first kisses of real, not merely would-be passion she had ever given and, as she thought, received, and the reverberations in her body were as extraordinary as though this moment had already made a woman of her. It is a process much like having a tooth pulled, although immediately afterward there is less of one's body than before, one actually feels more complete because a source of disquiet has been definitively removed. Hence, when Gerda felt the inner resolution of this chord, she pulled herself up, full of fresh determination. "You haven't even asked me what I came to tell you," she said. That you love me, Ulrich said in some embarrassment. Oh no, only that your friend Arnheim is making a fool of your cousin, carrying on like a lover when what he's really after is something quite different, and Gerda told him what her papa had found out. The news in all its simplicity made a deep impression on Ulrich. He felt obliged to warn Diotima, who was sailing with wings outspread into a ludicrous disappointment. For despite the malicious satisfaction he took in dwelling on this image, he felt sorry for his beautiful cousin. But most of all he was overcome with heartfelt appreciation for Papa Musil. Although he was on the verge of doing him a great wrong, he sincerely admired the man's reliable old-fashioned business sense, with its decorative border of fine sturdy convictions, which had hit on the simplest explanation for all the mysteries surrounding that modish great mind. Ulrich's mood had been altered, leaving far behind the tender demands made on him by Gerda's presence. He couldn't believe that only a few days ago he had been able to think that he could open his heart to this girl. Surmounting the inner and parts, he thought, is what Hans calls his sacrilegious notion of two lovesick angels coming together, and he savored, as though he were running his fingers over it in his mind, the wonderfully smooth, hard surface of the matter-of-fact form life had taken on nowadays, THTMKS to the good sense of Leo Musil and his like. All he could find to say was your papa is a wonder. Gerda was so full of the importance of her news that she had expected something more. She didn't know exactly what, but something like the moment when all the instruments in the orchestra, winds and strings, strike up in unison, and Ulrich's indifference was a painful reminder of how he had always made a point of siding with the average, the ordinary, the matter-of-fact aspect of things to deflate her. She had tried to see this as a prickly kind of making advances, something not altogether alien to her own young girl's ways, but now, when they had really begun to love each other, her somewhat childish formula went, she felt it now, a clear warning that the man to whom she was giving herself so recklessly was not taking her seriously enough. It was a blow to her new self-confidence, and yet she was also oddly pleased by not being taken say one iously T greater than North. It was a relief, compared with the strain in KP less than ping up her relationship with Hans, and while she did not less than stand Ulrich's praise of her father, it somehow restored an order of things she had disturbed by hurting Papa Leo because tilde of Hans. This mild sense of making a somewhat unusual re-entry into the bosom of her family by way of losing her virtue so distracted her that she gently resisted the pressure of Ulrich's arm and said to him, "Let's understand each other first as human beings, and the rest will take care of itself." These words came from a manifesto of her group, the so-called Community in Action, and was all that was left at the moment of Hans Sepp and his circle. I sensed but Ulrich had put his arm around her again because, knowing that he had something important to do since hearing the news about Arnheim, he first had to finish this episode with Gerda. He was not at all reconciled to having to go through everything the situation called for, but he immediately put the rejected arm around her again, this time in that wordless language which, without force, states more firmly than words can do that any further resistance is useless. Gerda felt the virility of that arm all the way down her spine. She had lowered her head, with her eyes fixed on her lap as though it held, gathered as in an apron, all the thoughts that would help her to reach that human understanding with Ulrich before anything could be allowed to happen as a crowning act. But she felt her face looking duller and more vacuous by the moment until, like an empty husk, it finally floated upward, with her eyes directly below the eyes of the seducer. He bent down and covered this face with ruthless kisses that stir the flesh. Gerda straightened up as if she had no will of her own and let herself be led the 10 steps or so to Ulrich's bedroom, leaning heavily on him as though she were wounded or sick. Her feet moved, one ahead of the other, as if she had nothing to do with it, even though she did not let herself be dragged along but went of her own accord. STWH and Imravoid. Despite all that excitement was something Gerda had NTA VT greater than unknown before. It was as if all the blood had been drained from HLR. She was freezing, yet in passing a mirror that seemed to melate H less than A image from a great distance she could see that her face was a cop less than re-red, with flecks of white. Suddenly, as in a street accident when the eye is hypersensitive to the whole scene, she took in the man's bedroom with all its detail. It came to her that, had she become sen was less than a censor and more calculating, she might have moved in here as UX wife. It would have made her very happy, but she was groping for words to say that she was outly any advantage and had come only to give herself to him, yet the words did not come, and she told herself that this had to happen, and opened the collar of her dress. Ulrich had released her. He, I sensed, would not bring himself to help undress her like a fond lover and stood apart, flinging off his own clothes. Gerda saw the man's tall, straight body, powerfully poised between violence and beauty. Panic-stricken, she noticed that her own body, still standing there in her underthings, was covered with goose flesh. Again she groped for words that might help her, that might make her less of a miserable figure where she stood. She longed to say something that would turn Ulrich into her lover in a way she vaguely imagined as dissolving in infinite sweetness, something one could achieve without having to do what she was about to do, something as blissful as it was indefinable. For an instant she saw herself standing with him in a field of candles growing out of the earth, row upon row to infinity, like so many pansies, all bursting into a flame at her feet on signal. But as she could not utter a single word of all this, she went on feeling painfully unattractive and miserable, her arms trembling. Unable to finish undressing, she had to clamp her bloodless lips together to keep them from twitching weirdly without a sound. At this point Ulrich, who saw her agony and realized that the whole struggle up to now might come to nothing, went over to her and slipped off her shoulder straps. Gerda slid into bed like a boy. For an instant Ulrich saw a naked adolescent in motion. It affected him no more, sexually, than the sudden blinking of a fish. He guessed that Gerda had made up her mind to get it over with because it was too late to get out of it, and he had never yet perceived as clearly as in the instant he followed her into bed how much the passionate intrusion into another body is a sequel to a child's liking for secret and forbidden hiding places. His hands encountered the girl's skin, still bristling with fear, and he felt frightened too, instead of attracted. This body, Ali flabby while still unripe, repelled him. It made no sense to do what he was doing, and he would have liked nothing better than to escape from this bed, so that he had to call to mind everything he could think of that would help him to see it through. In his frantic haste he summoned up all the usual reasons people find nowadays to justify their acting without sincerity, or faith, or scruple, or satisfaction, and in abandoning himself to this effort he found, not, of course, any feeling of love, but a half-crazy anticipation of something like a massacre, a sex murder or, if there is such a thing, a lustful suicide, inspired by the demons of the void who lurk behind all of life's images. This reminded him of his brawl with the hoodlums that night he met Benadir, and he decided to be quicker this time. But now something awful happened. Gerda had been gathering up all her inner resources to alchemize them into willpower with which to resist the shameful terror she was suffering, as though she were facing her execution. But the instant she felt Ulrich beside her, so strangely naked, his hands on her bare skin, her body flung off all her will. Even while somewhere deep inside her she still felt a friendship beyond words for him, a trembling, tender longing to put her arms around him, kiss his hair, follow his voice to its source with her lips, and imagined that to touch his real self would make her melt like a fragment of snow on a warm hand, but it would have to be the Ulrich she knew, dressed as usual, as he appeared in the familiar setting of her parental home, not this naked stranger whose hostility she sensed and who did not take her sacrifice seriously even as he gave her no time to think what she was doing. Gerda suddenly heard herself screaming. Like a little cloud, a soap bubble, a scream hung in the air, and others a middle dot followed, little screams expelled from her chest as though she were wrestling with something, a whimpering from which high-pitched cries of "ee" bubbled and floated off, from lips that grimaced and twisted and were wet as if with deadly lust. She wanted to jump up, but she couldn't move. Her eyes would not obey her and kept sending out signals without permission. Gerda was pleading to be let off, like a child facing some punishment or being taken to the doctor, who cannot go one step farther because it is being torn and convulsed by its own shrieks of terror. Her hands were up over her breasts, and she was menacing Ulrich with her nose while frantically pressing her long thighs together. This revolt of her body against herself was frightful. She perceived it with utmost clarity as a kind of theatre, but she was also the audience sitting alone and desolate in the dark auditorium and could do nothing to prevent her fate from being acted out before her, in a screaming frenzy, nothing to keep herself from taking the lead in the performance. Ulrich stared in horror into the tiny pupils of her veiled eyes, with their strangely unbending gaze, and watched, aghast, those weird motions in which desire and taboo, the soul and the soulless, were indescribably intertwined. His eye caught a fleeting glimpse of her pale fair skin and the short black hairs that shaded into red where they grew more densely. It occurred to him that he was facing a fit of hysteria, and he had no idea how to handle it. He was afraid that these horribly distressing screams might get even louder, and remembered that such a fit might be stopped by an angry shout or even by a sudden, vicious slap. Then the thought that this horror might have been avoided somehow led him to think that a younger man might persist in going further with Gerda even in these circumstances. That might be a way of getting her over it, he thought. Perhaps it's a mistake to give in to her, now that the silly goose has let herself in too deep. He did nothing of the sort. It was only that such irritable thoughts kept zigzagging through his mind while he was instinctively whispering an uninterrupted stream of comforting words, promising not to do anything to her, assuring her that nothing had really happened, asking her to forgive him, at the same time that all his words, swept up like chaff in his loathing of the scene she was making, seemed to him so absurd and undignified that he had to fight off a temptation to grab an armful of pillows to press on her mouth and choke off these shrieks that wouldn't stop. At long last her fit began to wear off and her body quieted down. Her eyes brimming with tears, she sat up in the bed, her little breasts drooping slackly from a body not yet under the mind's full control. Ulrich took a deep breath, again overcome with repugnance at the inhuman, merely physical aspects of the experience. Gerda was regaining normal consciousness. Something bloomed in her eyes, like the first actual awakening after the eyes had been open for some time, and she stared blankly ahead for a second, then noticed that she was sitting up stark naked and glanced at Ulrich, the blood came in great waves back to her face. Ulrich couldn't think of anything better to do than whisper the same reassurances to her again. He put his arm around her shoulder, drew her to his chest, and told her to think nothing of it. Gerda found herself back in the situation that had driven her to hysteria, but now everything looked strangely pale and forlorn, the tumbled bed, her nude body in the arms of a man intently whispering to her, the feelings that had brought her to this. She was fully aware of what it all meant, but she also knew that something horrible had happened, something she would rather not focus on, and while she could tell that Ulrich's voice sounded more tender, all it meant was that he regarded her as a sick person, but it was he who had made her sick. Still, it no longer mattered, all she wanted was to be gone from this place, to get away without having to say a word. She dropped her head and pushed Ulrich away, felt for her camisole, and pulled it over her head like a child or someone who did not care how she looked. Ulrich helped her to dress, he even pulled her stockings up over her legs, and he also felt as though he were dressing a child. Gerda was a bit unsteady on her feet when she stood up. She thought of how she had felt earlier in the day when she left home, the home to which she was about to return, and felt, in deep misery and shame, that she had not passed the test. She did not utter a word in answer to anything Ulrich was saying. A very distant memory came back to her, of Ulrich once saying, as a joke on himself, that solitude sometimes led him into excess. She did not feel angry at him. She simply wanted never again to hear him say anything whatsoever. When he offered to get her a cab, she only shook her head, pulled her hat on over her ruffled hair, and left him without a glance. Seeing her walk away with her veil now sadly trailing from her hand, he felt awkward as a schoolboy. He probably should not have let her go in this state, but he could think of no way to stop her, half-dressed as he was because he had been attending to her, unprepared even to confront the serious mood in which he was left, as though he would have to get fully dressed before he could decide what to do with himself. 120. The parallel campaign causes a stir. When Walter reached the center of town, he sensed something in the air. There was no visible difference in the way people moved on the sidewalks or in the carriages and streetcars, and if there was something unusual here and there, it faded out before one could tell what it was. Nevertheless, everything seemed to be carrying a little sign pointing in one direction, and Walter had barely walked a few steps before he felt such a sign on himself as well. He followed the indicated direction and felt that the Department of Fine Arts official he was, as well as the struggling painter and musician, and even Clarissa's tormented husband, were all giving way to a person who was none of the above. The very streets, with all their bustle and their ornate, pompous buildings, seemed to be in an analogous expectant state, as though the hard facets of a crystal were being dissolved in some liquid medium and about to fall back into an earlier, more amorphous condition. However conservative he was in rejecting innovations, he was also always ready in his QWN mind to condemn the present, and the dissolution of the existing order that he was now sensing was positively stimulating. As in his recent daydream, the crowds he ran into had an aura of mobility and haste, and a unity that seemed more unforced than the usual group spirit based on intellect, morality, and sound security measures, more that of a free, informal community. They made him think of a huge bunch of flowers just after it has been untied, opening freely without a middle dot, however, falling apart, and of a body unclothed, standing free, smiling, naked, having no need of words. Nor was he troubled when, quickening his pace, he ran into a large contingent of police standing by. He enjoyed the sight, like that of a Terry camp in readiness for the alarm to be given, all those red uniform collars, dismounted riders, movements of small units reporting their arrival or departure, stirred his senses into a warlike mood. Beyond this point, where a cordon was about to be drawn across the street, the scene was more somber. There were hardly any women on the sidewalks, and even the colorful uniforms of the army officers who normally were seen hereabouts when off duty had somehow been swallowed up by the prevailing uncertainty. There were still many pedestrians like himself coming downtown, but the impression they gave was more that of chaff and litter in the wake of a strong gust of wind. Soon he saw the first groups forming, apparently held together not only by curiosity but just as much by indecision whether to follow the unusual attraction farther or to turn round and go home. Walter's questions elicited a variety of answers. Some said that there was a great patriotic parade, others thought they had heard of a protest march against certain dangerously nationalistic activists, and opinions were equally split as to whether the general uproar was caused by the Pan-Germans protesting against the government's coddling of the Slavic minorities, as most people thought, or by loyal supporters of the government urging all patriotic Caucasians to march shoulder to shoulder in its defense against such continual disorders. They were all to-get-alongs like himself and knew nothing more than he had already heard rumored at the office, but an irrepressible itch to gossip led Walter on to speak to people, and even though they mostly admitted to having no idea, or laughed the whole thing off as a joke, including their own curiosity, the farther he went the more everyone seemed to be in agreement that it was high time something was done, though no one volunteered to tell him just what that should be. As he kept on, he noticed more often on the faces he met something senseless that overflowed and drowned out reason itself, something that told him that no one cared any longer what was happening, wherever they were being drawn to, as long as it was something unusual that would take them out of themselves, if only in the attenuated form of a common general excitement, suggesting a remote kinship with long-forgotten states of communal ecstasy and transfiguration, a sort of developing unconscious readiness to leap out of their clothes, and even their skins. Trading speculations and saying things that were not at all in character, Walter fell in with the rest, who were gradually transforming themselves from small crumbling groups of people, just waiting, and other people walking aimlessly along, into a procession that advanced toward the supposed scene of events, still without any definite intent yet visibly growing in density and energy. Emotionally they were still at the stage where they were like rabbits scampering about outside their burrows, ready to scunge back inside at the slightest sign of danger, when from the front of the disordered procession, far ahead and out of sight, a more definite sort of excitement came rippling back toward the rear. Up there a group of students, young men anyway, who had already taken some sort of action and had returned from the battlefield, joined the vanguard, and sounds of talking and shouting too far away to be understood, garbled messages, and waves of excitement were running through the crowd and, depending on the listeners' temperaments or what scraps of information they snatched up, spread indignation or fear, the itch to fight or some moral imperative, causing the gathering mob to thrust forward in a mood guided by the kind of commonplace notions that take a different form inside every head but are of so little significance, despite being uppermost in the consciousness, that they join in a single vital force that affects the muscles more than the brain. In the midst of this moving throng, Walter also became infected and soon found himself in that stimulated but vacuous state rather like the early stages of drunkenness. Nobody really knows the exact nature of the change that turns individuals with a will of their own into a mob with a single will, capable of going to the wildest extremes of good or evil and incapable of stopping to think anything through, even if most of the individuals involved have spent their lives dedicated to moderation and prudence in the conduct of their private affairs. A mob in a state of mounting excitement for which it has no outlet will probably discharge all that energy into the first available channel, and thrust among its participants who are the most excitable, sensitive, and most vulnerable to pressure, those at the extreme end of the spectrum who are primed to commit sudden acts of violence or rise to unprecedented levels of sentimental generosity, are most likely to set the example and lead the way. They are the points of least resistance in the mass, but the shout that is uttered through them rather than by them, the stone that somehow finds its way into their hands, the emotion into which they burst, is what opens the way along which the others, who have been generating excitement among themselves to the point where it must be discharged, then come surging in a frenzy, giving to what happens the character of mob action, which is experienced by those involved in it as both compulsion and liberation. What makes such agitated behavior interesting, incidentally, observable as it is among spectators of any sporting event or among crowds listening to speeches, is not so much the psychology of the emotional release it affords as the question of what it is that primes people to get themselves into such a state in the first place. Assuming that life makes sense, even its senseless manifestations would have some meaning and would not necessarily look like mere demonstrations of mental deficiency. Walter happened to know this better than most and could think of all sorts of remedies for it, so that he was constantly struggling against being swept along by this tidal wave of communal passion, which, demeaning as it was, nevertheless raised his spirits sky high. The thought of Clarisse flashed through his mind. What a good thing she isn't here, he thought, she'd be crushed flat. A stab of grief kept him from pursuing his thought of her. With it had come the all too distinct impression she had given him of being raving mad. Maybe I'm the one that's mad, he thought. Bees, it's taken me so long to notice it. I soon will be, if I go on living /ith her. I don't believe it, he thought, but there's no doubt about it. Height between my hands, her darling face turned into a hideous mask. He thought. But he couldn't think it all through properly, his mind was awash with despair. He could only feel that despite his unpilled anguish for her, it was incomparably finer to love Clarisse than to be in with the pack here, and to escape his fears, he pressed himself deeper into the ranks of the marchers. Meanwhile Ulrich had arrived at the Palais Ohnsdorf, though by an oath greater than RCMTL. As he turned into the gate he noticed a double guard at the entrance and a large detachment of police stationed inside the law yard. His Grace welcomed him with composure, while apparently aware of having become a target of popular disfavor. I think I once told you that anything favored by a good many people is some men out to be worthwhile. Well, I have to take that back. Of less than lufts, there are exceptions, he said. His new majordomo now arrived with the latest bulletin. The demonstrators were approaching the Palais, and should he arrange to have the gate and shutters locked? His Grace shook his head. What an idea, he said kindly. They'd like nothing better, it would allow them to think we're afraid of them. Besides, we've got all those men down there from the police looking out for us. Then, turning to Ulrich, he said indignantly, let them come and smash our windows. I told you all along that all that intellectual chatter would get us nowhere. Behind his far-tilted way of dignified arm, a deep resentment seemed to be working within him. Ulrich had just walked over to the window when the marchers arrived. They were flanked by police, who dispersed the onlookers lining the avenue like a cloud of dust raised by the firm tread of the marchers. A little farther back, vehicles could be seen wedged in the crowd, while its relentless current flowed around them in endless black waves on which the foam of upturned faces seemed to be dancing. When the spearhead of the mob came within sight of Count Ohnsdorf's windows, it looked as though it had been slowed down by some command. An immense ripple ran backward along the column as the advancing ranks jammed up, like a muscle tightening before launching a blow. The next instant this blow came whizzing through the air, in the weird form of a massed shout of indignation made visible by all those wide-open mouths before their roar was heard. In rhythmical succession the rows of faces snapped open as they arrived on the scene, and since the noise of the ones in the rear was blotted out by the louder noise of those in the front, the spectacle could be seen repeating itself continually in the distance. The more of the mob, Count Ohnsdorf said, just behind Ulrich, as solemnly as if it were some familiar phrase like our daily bread. But what is it they're actually yelling? I can't make it out, with all that din. Ulrich said he thought they were mostly screaming boo. Yes, but there's something more, isn't there? Ulrich did not tell him that among the indistinct dancing sound waves of boos, a clear, long drawn-out down with Ohnsdorf could often enough be heard. He even thought he had heard several outcries of hooray for Germany, interspersed with Lorry.G but could not be absolutely sure, because the thick glass of the windows muffled the sounds. Ulrich had come here as soon as Gerda left him, because he felt it was necessary to tell Count Ohnsdorf, if no one else, the news that had come to his ears, which exposed Arnheim beyond all expectation. He had not yet had a chance to speak of it. As he looked down at the dark surge of bodies beneath, The window, thoughts of his own days in the army made him say to himself, it would take only one company to make a clean sweep of the square. He could imagine all those gaping mouths turning into a single frothing maw, suddenly succumbing to panic, growing slack and drooping at the edges, lips slowly sinking over teeth. His imagination transformed the menacing black crowd into a flock of hens scattering before a dog rushing into their midst. All his anger had contracted again into a hard knot, but the old satisfaction in watching moral man retreat before brute violent man was, as always, a two-edged feeling. "Are you all right?" Count Lonsdorff was asking. He had been pacing the floor behind Ulrich and had actually received the impression from some odd movement of Ulrich's that he had cut himself, though there was no sharp-edged object anywhere in the vicinity. When he received no answer, he stood still, shook his head, and said, "We must not forget, after all, that it is not so very long since His Majesty's generous decision to let the people have a voice in the conduct of their own affairs. So it is understandable that a degree of universal political maturity that would be worthy of our sovereign's magnanimity is still lacking. I believe I said as much at our very first meeting." This little speech made Ulrich drop any notion of telling his grace or Diotima about Arnheim's machinations. Despite his antagonism to Arnheim, he felt closer to him than to the others, and his memory of himself setting upon Gerda, like a big dog on a howling little one, a memory he now realized had been haunting him all along, troubled him less when he thought of Arnheim's infamous conduct toward Diotima. The episode of the screaming body staging a dramatic scene for a captive audience of two embarrassed souls could also be seen from the farcical side, and the people down there in the street at whom Ulrich was still staring spellbound without taking the slightest notice of Count Lonsdorff were also staging a fuss. It was this that fascinated him. They did not really want to attack or rip anyone apart, although they looked as if they did. They made a serious show of being enraged, but it was not the kind of seriousness that drives men into a line of fire, not even that of a fire brigade. They're only going through some kind of ritual, he thought, some time-hallowed display of righteous indignation, the half-civilized, half-barbaric legacy of ancient communal rights no individual need take wholly seriously. He envied them. How appealing they are, even in this state where they are doing their best to be as unappealing as possible, he thought. The warm defense against loneliness that a crowd provides came radiating up from below, and here he was, fated to stand up here, outside its protective shelter. He felt this vividly, for an instant, as if he were looking up from down there and seeing his own image behind the thick pane of glass set in the wall of the building. It would have been better for him and his fate, he felt, had he been able to fly into a rage at this moment, or, on Count Lonsdorff's behalf, give the alarm to the guard, or alternatively had he been cap able of feeling close to the people as their friend, a man who plays cards with his fellows, bargains with them, quarrels with them, and enjoys the same pleasures they do, is free to order them shot, too, when the occasion calls for it, without it seeming to be anything unnatural. There is a way of being on good terms with life that allows a man to go about his business with no second thoughts, in a live and let live fashion, Ulrich was thinking. It may have a peculiarity of its 9WLL but is no less dependable than a natural instinct, and it is from this that the intimate scent of a healthy personality emanates, while whoever lacks this gift for compromise with life and is solitary, unyielding, and in dead earnest makes the others feel uneasy and unnerves them, as a caterpillar might, not because it is dangerous but because it is repellent. He felt a depressing aversion for the unnaturalness of the solitary man and his mental games, such as may be aroused by the sight of a turbulent crowd in the grip of natural, shared emotions. The demonstration had been growing more intense. Count Lonsdorff was pacing the room in some agitation, with an occasional glance through the second window. He was in distress, though he would not show it. His eyes protruded like two little marbles from among the soft furrows of his face, and he stretched his arms now and then before he crossed them again behind his back. Ulrich suddenly realized that it was he, who had been standing at the window the whole time, who was being taken for the Count. All the eyes their dot seemed focused on his face, and sticks were being brandished at him. A few steps beyond, where the street curved from view as though it were slipping into the wings, the performers were already beginning to take off the grease paint, as it were. There was no point in looking fierce for no one in particular, so they naturally let their faces relax, and some even began to joke and laugh as if they were on a picnic. Ulrich noticed this and laughed too, but the newcomers took him for the Count, laughing, and their rage rose to a fiercer pitch, which only made Ulrich laugh all the more and without restraint. But all at once he broke off in disgust. With his eyes still moving from their threatening open-mouthed faces to the high-spirited ones farther back, and his mind refusing to absorb any more of this spectacle, he was undergoing a strange transformation. I can't go on with this life, and I can't keep on rebelling against it any longer, either, was what he felt, while keenly aware of the room behind him with the large paintings on the wall, the long empire desk, the stiff perpendicular lines of draperies and bell ropes, like another, smaller stage, with him standing up front on the apron, in the opening between the curtains, facing the drama running its course on the greater stage outside. The two stages had their own way of fusing into one without regard for the fact that he was standing between them. Then his sense of the room behind him contracted and turned inside out, passing through him or flowing past him as if turned to water, making for a strange spatial inversion, Ulrich thought, so that the people were passing behind him. Perhaps he had passed through them and arrived beyond them at some 0 point, or else they were moving both before and behind him, lapping against him as the same ever-changing ripples of a stream lap against a stone in their midst. It was an experience beyond his understanding, He was chiefly aware of the glassiness, emptiness, tranquility of the state in which he found himself. Is it really possible, he wondered, to leave one's own space for some hidden other space? He felt as though chance had led him through a secret door. He shook these dreams off with so violent a motion of his whole body that Count Lonsdorff stood still in surprise. "Whatever is the matter with you today?" His Grace asked. "You're taking it much too hard." "I must stick to my decision. The Germans will have to be won over by way of the non-Germans, whether it hurts or not." At these words Ulrich was at least able to smile again, and was grateful to see the Count's face before him, with all its knots and furrows. He was reminded of that special moment just before a plane lands, when the ground rises up again with all its voluptuous cottage tours out of the mape-like flatness to which it had been reduced for hours on end, and things revert to their familiar earthly meanings, which seemed to be growing out of the ground itself. At the same moment the incredible idea flashed through his mind to commit some crime, or perhaps it was an unfocused passing image, for he was not thinking of anything in particular. It might have had some reference to Moos Brugger, for he would have liked to help that fool whom fate had chanced to bring his way as two people come to occupy the same park bench. But all this crime really amounted to for him was the urge to shut himself out, to abandon the life he had been living companionably with others. His dissident or even misanthropic attitude, his so variously justified and well-earned position, had not arisen from anything, there was nothing to justify it, it simply existed, he had held it all his life, though rarely with such intensity. It is probably safe to say that in all the revolutions that have ever taken place in this world, it has always been the thinking men who have come off worst. They always begin with the promise of a new civilization, make a clean sweep of every advance hitherto achieved by the human mind as though it were enemy property, and are overtaken by the next upheaval before they can surpass the heights previously attained. Our so-called periods of civilization are nothing but a long series of detours, one for every failure of movement forward. The idea of placing himself outside this series was nothing new for Ulrich. The only new element was the increasing force of the signs that his mind was coming to a decision and that he was, in fact, ready to act on it. He did not make the slightest effort to come down to specifics. For some moments he was content to be permeated with the feeling that this time it would not be something general or theoretical, the sort of thing he had grown so tired of, but that he must do something personal, take an action that would involve him as a man of flesh and blood, with arms and legs. He knew that at the instant of committing his undefined crime he would no longer be in the position to defy the world openly, but only God knew why this should arouse a middle dot in him such a sensation of passionate tenderness. It was somehow linked with his strange spatial experience of a while ago, a faint echo of which he could bring back at will, when what was happening on this side and on the other side of the window fused into one to form an obscurely exciting relationship to the world that might have suggested to Ulrich if he could have taken the time to think about it the legendary voluptuousness that overcame mythical heroes on the point of being devoured by the goddesses they had wooed. Instead, he was interrupted by Count Lonsdorff, who had meanwhile fought his own inner struggle through to a decision. "I must stay at my post and face down this insurrection," his Grace began, "so I can't leave. But you, my dear fellow, must really go to your cousin as quickly as possible, before she has time to be frightened and possibly moved to say something to some reporter that might not be quite the thing at this moment. You might tell her." He paused to consider his message. "Yes, it will be best if you say to her, strong remedies produce strong reactions. And tell her, too, that those who set out to make life better must not shrink, in a crisis, from using the stake or the knife." He stopped again to think, with an almost alarming look of resolution, as his trim little beard rose and then sank to a downward, vertical position every time he was on the verge of saying something but paused to reconsider. In the end, his innate kindliness broke through and he said, "But tell her not to worry, not to be afraid of the troublemakers. The more of a case they have, the more quickly they adjust themselves to the realities when they are given a chance. I don't know whether you've noticed this, but there has never yet been an opposition party that a middle dot didn't cease to be in opposition when they took over the helm. This is not merely, as you might think, something that goes without saying. It is, rather, a very important point, because it is, if I may say so, the basic reality. The touchstone, the continuity in politics. 1.21. Talking man to man. When Ulrich arrived at Diotima's, Rachel, who let him in, told him that Madame was out but that Dr. Amine was there, waiting for her. Ulrich said he would wait too, not noticing that his little ally of the other night had blushed scarlet at the sight of him. Amine, who had been at the window, watching what unrest there still was in the streets, crossed the room to shake hands with Ulrich. His face lit up at seeing Ulrich unexpectedly, for he had wanted to speak with Ulrich but had hesitated to seek him out. However, he did not want to rush into things, and could not immediately think of a good opening. Ulrich was also reluctant to start off with the Galicial fields, and so both men fell silent after their first words of greeting and ended up walking over to the window together, where they stared mutely at the flurries of movement down below. After a while, Arnheim spoke. "I really don't understand you. Isn't it 1,000 times more important to come to grips with life than to write?" "But I haven't been writing," Ulrich said crisply. "I'm glad to hear it." Arnheim adjusted to the fact. "Writing, like the pearl, is a disease. Look down there." He pointed two of his beautifully manicured fingers at the street, with a movement that for all a middle dot its rapidity had the air of a papal blessing about it. "See how they come along, singly and in clusters, and from time to time a mouth is torn open and something inside makes it yell something. The same man under different circumstances would write something. I agree with you on that. But you are a famous writer yourself, aren't you? Oh, that doesn't mean anything. But after saying this, gracefully leaving the question open, Arnheim turned to face Ulrich, confronting him as it were broadside, and standing chest to chest with him, said, carefully spacing his words, "May I ask you something?" Ulrich could not say a no to that, of course, but as he had instinctively moved back a little, this rhetorical courtesy served to rope him in again. "I hope," Arnheim began, "that you will not hold our recent little difference of opinion against me but rather credit it to my keen interest in your views even when they seem as they do often an auto-run counter to mine. So let me ask you whether you really and what you said to sum it up, if I may, that we must live with a tie train on our conscience. Is this a good way of putting it?" The smile Ulrich gave him in answer said, "I don't know, let me wait and see what more you have to say. You spoke of having to leave life in a free-floating state, like a certain kind of metaphor that hovers inconclusively between two worlds at once, as it were. Did you not? You also said some extremely fascinating things to your cousin. I would be mortified if you were to take me for a Prussian industrial militarist who is unlikely to understand that sort of thing. But you say, for instance, that our reality and our history arise only from those aspects of ourselves that don't matter. I take this to mean that we must change the forms and patterns of what happens, and that it doesn't matter much, in your opinion, what happens meanwhile to Tom, Dick, and Harry. What I mean," Ulrich interjected warily and reluctantly, "is that our reality is like a fabric being turned out by the thousands of bales, technically flawless in quality but in antiquated patterns no one bothers to bring up to date. In other words, Arnheim broke in, I understand you to say that the present state of the world, which is clearly unsatisfactory, arises from our leaders' concern with making world history instead of turning all our energies to permeating the world of power with new ideas. An even closer analogy to our present state of affairs is the case of the manufacturer who keeps turning out goods in response to the market, instead of regulating it. So you see that your ideas touch me very closely. But just because of this you must see that these ideas at times strike me, a man continually engaged in making decisions that keep vast industries going, as positively monstrous. Such as when you do. Men that we give up attaching any meaningful reality to our actions. Or propose that we abandon the provisionally definitive character of our behavior, as our friend Lunsdorf so gracefully phrases it, when, in fact, we can do no such thing. I demand nothing at all, Ulrich said. Oh, you demand a great deal more. You demand that we live our lives in a scientific, experimental way, Arnheim said with energy and warmth. You want responsible leaders to regard their job not as making history but as a mandate to draw up reports on experiments as a basis for further experiments. A perfectly delightful idea, of course. But how do wars and revolutions for instance fit in with that? Can you raise the dead when your experiment has been carried out and taken off the schedule? Ulrich now succumbed after all to the temptation to talk, which is not so very different from the temptation to go on smoking, and conceded that one probably had to tackle everything one wanted to do effectively with the utmost seriousness, even when one knew that in 50 years every experiment would turn out not to have been worthwhile. But such a punctured seriousness has nothing so very unusual. After all, people risk their lives every day in sport and for nothing at all. Psychologically, there was nothing impossible about a life conducted as an experiment. All that was needed was the determination to assume a certain unlimited responsibility. That's the crucial difference, he concluded. In the old days, people felt as it were deductively, starting from certain assumptions. Those days are gone. Today we live without a guiding principle, but also without any method of conscious, inductive thinking. We simply go on trying this and that like a band of monkeys. Splendid. Arnheim admitted freely. But allow me one last question. Your cousin tells me that you're taking a great interest in the case of a dangerous psychopath. I happen to understand this very well, incidentally. We really don't know how to handle such cases, and society's method of dealing with them is disgracefully hit or miss. But in the circumstances which leave us no choice but either to kill an innocent man or to let him go on killing innocent people, would you let him escape the night before his execution, if you could? No. Ulrich said. No? Really not? Arnheim asked with sudden animation. I don't know. I don't think so. I might of course talk myself out of it by claiming that in a malfunctioning world I have no right to act freely on my own personal convictions, but I shall simply admit that I don't know what I would do. That man must surely be stopped from doing other harm, Arnheim said pensively. And yet, when he is having one of his seizures, he is certainly a man possessed by the demonic, which in all virile epochs has been felt to be akin to the divine. In the old days such a man would have been sent into the wilderness. Even then he might have committed murder, but perhaps in a visionary state, like Abraham about to slaughter his son Isaac. There it is. We no longer have any idea of how to deal with such things, and there is no sincerity in what we do. Arnheim might have let himself be carried away in uttering these last words without quite knowing what he meant by them. His ambition might have been spurred on by Ulrich's not mustering up enough heart and rashness to answer with an unqualified yes. When asked whether he would save Moosbrugger, But although Ulrich felt this time of the conversation to be almost an omen, an unexpected reminder of his resolve at Countelsdorf's, he resented Amim's flamboyance in making the most of the Moosbrugger problem, and both factors made him ask dryly, but intently, "Would you set him free?" "No," Amim replied with a smile, "but I'd like to propose something else." And without giving him time to put up resistance, he added, "It's a suggestion I've been wanting to make to you for some time, to make you give up your suspicions of me, which, frankly, hurt my feelings. I want you on my side, in fact. Do you have any conception of what a great industrial enterprise looks like from the inside? It is controlled by two bodies, the top management and the board of directors, usually capped by a third body, the executive committee, as you in Austria call it, made up of representatives of the first two, which meets almost every day. The board of directors naturally consists of men who enjoyed the confidence of the majority shareholders." Here he paused for the first time, to give Ulrich a chance to speak if he wished, as though testing to see whether Ulrich had already noticed something. "As I was saying, the majority shareholders have their representatives on the board and the executive committee." He prompted Ulrich. "Have you any idea who this majority is?" Ulrich had none. He had only a vague general concept of finance, which to him meant clerks, counters, coupons, and certificates that looked like ancient documents. Arnheim cued him in again. "Have you ever helped to elect a board of directors?" "No, you haven't," he answered his own question. "There would be no point in trying to imagine it, since you will never own the majority of shares in a company." He said this so firmly that Ulrich very nearly felt ashamed of being found wanting in so important a respect, and it was in fact just like Amim to move in one easy stride from his demons to his board of directors. Smiling, he continued, "There is one person I haven't mentioned yet. The most important of all, in a sense. I spoke of the majority shareholders, which sounds like a harmless plural but is in fact nearly always a single person, a chief shareholder, unnamed and unknown to the general public, hidden behind those he sends out front in his place." Ulrich now realized that he was being told things he could read in the papers every day. Still, Arnheim knew how to create suspense. He was sufficiently interested to ask who was the majority shareholder in Lloyd's of London. "No one knows," Amim replied quietly. "That is to say, there are those in the know, of course, but one doesn't usually hear it spoken of. But let me get to the point. Wherever you find two such forces, a person who really gives the orders and an administrative body that executes them, what automatically happens is that every possible means of increasing profits is used, or not it is morally or aesthetically attractive. When I say automatically I mean just that, because the way it works is to a high degree independent of any personal factor. The person who really wields the power takes no hand in carrying out his directives, while the managers are covered by the fact that they are acting not on their own behalf but as functionaries. You will find such arrangements everywhere these days, and by no means exclusively in the world of finance. You may depend on it that our friend Tutsi would give the signal for war with the clearest conscience in the world, even if as a man he may be incapable of shooting down an old dog, and your friend Moosbrugger will be sent to his death by thousands of people because only 3 of them need have a hand in it personally. This system of indirection elevated to an art is what nowadays enables the individual and society as a whole to function with a clear conscience. The button to be pressed is always clean and shiny, and what happens at the other end of the line is the business of others, who, for their part, don't press the button. Do you find this revolting? It is how we let thousands die or vegetate, set in motion whole avalanches of suffering, but we always get things done. I might go so far as to say that what we are seeing here, in this form of the social division of labor, is nothing else than the ancient dualism of conscience between the end that is approved and the means that are tolerated, though here we have it in a grandiose and dangerous form. In answer to Arnheim's question whether he found all this revolting, Ulrich had shrugged his shoulders. The split in the moral consciousness that Amim spoke of, this most horrifying phenomenon of modern life, was an ancient fact of human history, but it had won its appalling good conscience only in recent times, as a consequence of the universal division of labor with all its magnificent inevitability. Ulrich did not care to wax indignant over it, especially as it gave him, paradoxically, the funny and gratifying sensation one can get from tearing along at 100 miles an hour past a dust-bespattered moralist who is standing by the wayside, cursing. When Arnheim came to a stop, Ulrich's first words were, "Every kind of division of a middle table can be developed further. The question is not whether it repels me but whether I believe that we can attain more acceptable conditions without having to turn back the clock." "Aha, your general inventory," Amim interjected. "We have organized the division of labor brilliantly but neglected to find ways of correlating the results. We are continuously destroying the old morality and the soul in accordance with the latest patents, and think we can patch them up by resorting to the old household remedies of our religious and philosophical traditions. Levity on such a subject," he backed off, "is really quite distasteful to me, and I regard jokes on the whole as in dubious taste anyway. But then, I never thought of the suggestion you made to us all in the presence of Countelsdorf, that we need to reorganize the conscience itself, as a mere joke." "It was a joke," Ulrich said gruffly. "I don't believe in such a possibility. I would sooner be inclined to believe that the devil himself built up the European world and that God is willing to let the competition show what he can do." "A pretty conceit," Amim said. "But in that case, why were you Matilda so annoyed with me for not wanting to believe you?" Ulrich did not answer. What you said just now, Aim calmly persisted, also contradicts those adventurous remarks of yours, some time ago, about the means toward attaining the right way in life. Besides, quite apart from whether I can agree with you on the details, I can't help noticing the extent to which you are a compound of active tendencies and indifference. When Ulrich saw no need to reply even on this point, Arnheim said in the civil tone with which such rudeness must be met, I merely wished to draw your attention to the degree to which we are expected, even in making economic decisions, on which after all everything depends, to work out the problem of our moral responsibility on our own, and how fascinating this makes such decisions. Even in the restraint with which this reproof was expressed there was a faint suggestion of trying to win him over. A sensei I'm Sony, Ulrich said, I was totally caught up in what you've been saying. And as though he were still pursuing the same line of thought, he added, I wonder whether you also regard it as a form of indirect dealing and divided consciousness in keeping with the spirit of the times to fill a woman's soul with mystical feelings while sensibly leaving her body to her husband? These words made Arnheim color a little, but he did not lose control of the situation. I'm not sure I know what you mean, he said quietly, but if you were speaking of a woman you love, you couldn't say this, because their body of reality is always richer than the mere outline sketch we call principles. He had moved away from the window and invited Ulrich to sit down with him. You don't give in easily, he went on in a tone of mingled appreciation and regret. But I know that I represent to you more of a opposing principle than a personal opponent. And those who are privately the bitterest opponents of capitalism are often enough its best servants in the business world. I may even say that to some extent I count myself among them, or I wouldn't presume to say this to you. Uncompromising, passionately committed persons, once they have seen that a concession must be made, usually become its most brilliant champions. And so I want in any case to go ahead with my intended proposal. Will you accept a position in my firm? He took care to say this as casually as he could, trying by speaking rapidly and without emphasis to lessen the cheap surprise effect he could be only too sure of causing. Avoiding Ulrich's astonished gaze, he simply proceeded to go into the details without making any effort to indicate his own position. You wouldn't, of course, have the necessary training and qualifications at first, he said smoothly, to assume a leading position, nor would you feel inclined to do so. Therefore I would offer you a position at my side, let us say that of my executive secretary, which I would create especially for you. I hope you won't take offense at this, it is not a position I can see as carrying an irresistible salary. To begin with, however, in time, you should be able to aim for any income you might wish. In a year or so, I am sure that you will understand me quite differently from now. When Arnheim had finished, he felt moved in spite of himself. Actually, he had surprised himself by going so far in making this offer to Ulrich, who only had to refuse in order to put Arnheim at a disadvantage. If he accepted, there wasn't much in it for Aim. Any idea that this man he was talking to could accomplish something that he himself could not do on his own had vanished even as he spoke, and the need to charm Ulrich and get him into his power had become absurd in the very process of finding articulate expression. That he had been afraid of something he called this man's wit now seemed unnatural. He, Arnheim, was a man of some consequence, and for such a man life has to be simple. Such a man lives on good terms with other great men and circumstances. He does not act the romantic rebel or cast doubt on existing realities, it would be against his nature. On the other hand, there are, of course, all the things of beauty and ambiguity one wants in one's life as much as possible. Arnheim had never felt as intensely as he did at this moment the permanence of Western civilization, that marvelous network of forces and disciplines. If Ulrich did not recognize this he was nothing but an adventurer, and the fact that Aim had almost let himself be tempted to think of him as at this point words failed him, unformulated as they still were at the back of his mind, he could not bring himself to articulate clearly, even in secret, the fact that he had considered taking Ulrich on as an adopted son. Not that it really mattered, it was only an idea like countless others one need not answer for, probably inspired by the kind of moodiness that afflicts every man of action, because a man is never really satisfied, and perhaps he had not had this idea at all, in so dubious a form, but only some vague impulse that could be so interpreted. Still, he shied away from the memory, and only kept painfully in mind that the difference between Ulrich's age and his own was not all that great, and behind this there was a secondary, shadowy sense that Ulrich might serve him as a warning against Diotima. How often he had already felt that his relationship to Ulrich was somehow comparable to a secondary volcanic crater that emits the occasional warning or clue to the strange goings-on in the main crater, and he was somewhat troubled that the eruption had now occurred and his words had come pouring out and were making their way into real life. What's to be done, flashed through his mind, if this fellow accepts? It was in such suspense that Arnheim had to wait for the decision of a younger man who mattered only insofar as Arnheim's own imagination had lent him significance. Arnheim sat there stiffly, his lips parted in a hostile expression, thinking, there'll be a way of handling it, in case there's still not a way of getting out of it. Even while his feelings and thoughts were running their course in this fashion the situation had not come to a standstill, question and answer followed each other without pause. And to what qualities of my own, Ulrich asked dryly, do I owe this offer, which can hardly be justified from a businessman's point of view? You always misjudge this sort of thing, Arnheim replied. To be businesslike in my position is not the same as counting pennies. What I stand to lose on you is quite immaterial compared to what I hope to gain. You certainly pique my curiosity, Ulrich remarked. very seldom am I told I represent a gain of any kind. I might perhaps have developed into a minor asset in my special subject, but even there, as you know, I have been a disappointment. That you are a man of exceptional intelligence, L.A. Mime answered, in the same quiet tone of unshakable confidence to which he was outwardly clinging, is surely something of which you are fully aware without my having to tell you. Still, we may have keener and more dependable minds already working for us. It is actually your character, your human qualities, that, for certain reasons, I wish to have constantly at my side. My qualities. Ulrich could not help smiling at this. That's funny, I have friends who call me a man without qualities. Arnheim let slip a faint gesture of impatience that said, more or less, tell me about it, as if I didn't know. This twitch that ran across his face all the way to the shoulder betrayed his dissatisfaction, even while his words flowed on as programmed. Ulrich caught the fleeting grimace, and he was so ready to be provoked by Arnheim that he now dropped all restraint against bringing everything out into the open. They had meanwhile risen from their chairs, and Ulrich moved back a few steps to see his effect all the better as he said, you have asked me so many pointed questions, and now there is something I would like to know before I make my decision. When Arnheim nodded he went on in a frank and matter-of-fact tone, I've been told that your interest in our parallel campaign and everything connected with it, Frau Tutsi and my humble self thrown in for good measure, has to do with your acquiring major portions of the Gallus oil fields. Despite the failing light, Arnheim could be seen to have turned pale. He walked slowly up to Ulrich, who thought he had brought some rude answer upon himself and regretted his own rash bluntness, which had given the other men a way to break off the conversation when it became inconvenient for him to go on with it. So he said, as affably as he could, please don't misunderstand me. I have no wish to offend you, but there is surely no point in our conversation unless we can speak our minds with brutal frankness. These few words and the time it took him to cover the short distance enabled Arnheim to regain his composure. As he reached Ulrich he smiled, placed his hand actually, his arm on Ulrich's shoulder, and said reproachfully, how can you fall for such a typical stock exchange rumor? It reached me not as a rumor but as information from someone who knows what he is talking about. Yes, I know, I've heard that such things are being said, but how can you believe it? Of course I'm not here purely for pleasure, it's too bad, but I can never get away entirely from business affairs. And I won't deny that I have talked with some people about these oil fields, though I must ask you to keep this confidential. But what has this to do with anything? My cousin, Ulrich resumed, hasn't the remotest idea of your interest in oil. She has been asked by her husband to find out whatever she can about the reasons for your stay here, because you are regarded as a confidant of the Tsar, but I am convinced that she is not doing justice to this diplomatic mission because she is so sure that she herself is the one and only reason for your continued visit with us. H9W, can you be so indelicate? Arnheim's and gave Ulrich's shoulder a friendly little nudge. There are always secondary strings to everything, everywhere, but despite your sardonic intention you have just expressed yourself with the naked rudeness of a schoolboy. A middle dot that down on his shoulder made Ulrich unsure of himself. To stand there in this quasi-embrace was ridiculous and unpleasant, a miserable feeling, in fact. Still, it was a long time since Ulrich had known a friend, and perhaps this added an element of bewilderment. He would have liked to shake off the Anne, and he instinctively tried to do so, even while Mime, for his part, noticed these little signals of Ulrich's restiveness and did his utmost to ignore them. Ulrich, realizing the awkwardness of Arnheim's position, was too polite to move away and forced himself to put up with this physical contact, which felt increasingly like a heavyweight sinking into a loosely mounded dam and breaking it apart. Without meaning to, Ulrich had built up a wall of loneliness around himself, and now life, by way of another man's pulse beat, came pouring in through the breach in that wall, and silly as it was, ridiculous, really, he felt a touch of excitement. He thought of Gerda. He remembered how even his old friend Walter had aroused in him a longing to find himself once more in total accord with another human being, wholly and without restraint, as if the whole wide world held no differences other than those between like and dislike. Now that it was too late, this longing welled up in him again, as if in silvery waves, as the ripples of water, air, and light fuse into one silvery stream down the whole width of a river. It was so entrancing that he had to force himself to be on his guard and not to give in, lest he cause a misunderstanding in this ambiguous situation. But as his muscles tightened he remembered Bernadette saying to him, Ulrich, you're not a bad man, you merely make it hard for yourself to be good. Bernadette, who had been so incredibly wise that evening and who had also said, after all, in dreams you don't think either, you simply live them. And he had said, I was a child, as soft as the air on a moonlit night, and he now remembered that at the time he had actually had a different image in mind, the tip of a burning magnesium flare, for in the flying sparks that tore this tip to shreds he thought he recognized his heart, but that was a long TE ago. And he had not quite tried to make this comparison and had succumbed to the other, not in conversation with Bernadette, incidentally, but with Diotima, as he now recalled. All the divergences of life begin close together at their roots, he felt, looking at the man who had just now, for reasons not entirely clear, offered him his friendship. Mime had withdrawn his arm. They were standing once more in the window bay where their conversation had begun. On the street below, the lamps were already giving a peaceful light, though there was still a lingering sense of the excitement of earlier in the day. From time to time clusters of people passed by in heated talk, and here and there a mouth would open to shout a threat or some wavering hoo-hoo, followed L.Y. guffaws. One had the impression of semi-consciousness. And in the light from this restless street, between the vertical curtains framing the darkened room, he saw Arnheim's figure and felt his own body standing there, half brightly lit up and half dark, a chiaroscuro sharpening the intense effect. Ulrich remembered the cheers for Arnheim he thought he had heard, and whether or not the man had anything to do with what had happened. In his Caesar-like calm as he stood pensively, gazing down on the street, he projected himself as the dominant figure in this momentary light painting, and he also seemed to feel the weight of his own presence in every glance cast a middle dot upon him. At Arnheim's side one understood the meaning of self-possession. Consciousness alone cannot impose order on all the world's swarm and glow, since the keener it is, the more boundless the world becomes, at least for the moment, but that consciousness of self, that is self-possession, enters like a film director who artfully composes a scene into an image of happiness. Ulrich envied the man his happiness. In that instant nothing seemed easier than to do him some violence, for in his need to present an image at center stage this man conjured up all the old tags of melodrama. Draw your dagger and fulfill his destiny. Though the words came to mind only in the ranting tone of a ham actor, Ulrich had unconsciously moved so that he stood halfway behind Arnheim. He saw the dark, broad expanse of neck and shoulders before him. The neck in particular was a provocation. His hand groped in his right pocket for a penknife. He rose up on tiptoe and then once more looked over Arnheim's shoulder down on the street. Out there in the twilight, people were still being swept along like sand by an invisible tide pulling their bodies onward. Something would of course have to come of this demonstration, and so the future sent a wave ahead. Some sort of suprapersonal fecundation of humanity occurred, though as always in an extremely vague and slipshod manner, or so Ulrich perceived it as it briefly held his attention, but he was tired to the point of nausea at the thought of stopping to analyze it all. Carefully he lowered his heels again, ashamed of the mental byplay that had caused him to raise them just before, though he did not attach too much importance to it, and he now felt greatly tempted to tap Arnheim on the shoulder and say to him, "Thank you. I'm fed up and I would like something new in my life. I accept your offer." But as he did, "Not really. Do this, either." The two men let the answer to Arnheim's proposal go by default. Arnheim reverted to an earlier part of their conversation. "Do you ever go to see a film?" "You should," he said. "In its present form, cinematography may not look like much, but once the big interests get involved, the electrochemical, say, or the chromochemical concerns, you are likely to see a surging development in just a few decades, which nothing can stop. Every known means of raising and intensifying production will be brought into play, and whatever our writers and aesthetes may suppose to be their own part in it, we will be getting an art based on associated electrical or German dyes, incorporated. It's absolutely terrifying, you'll see." "Do you write?" "No, I remember I've asked you that. But why don't you write?" "Very sensible of you. The poet and philosopher of the future will emerge out of journalism, in any case. Haven't you noticed that our journalists are getting better all the time, while our poets are getting steadily worse? It is unquestionably a process in accordance with the laws of nature. Something is going on, and for my part one haven't the slightest doubt what it is. The age of great individuals is coming to an end." He leaned forward. "I can't see your face in this light. I'm firing all my shots in the dark." He gave a little laugh. "You've proposed a general stock-taking of our spiritual condition. Do you believe in that? Do you really suppose that life can be regulated by the mind? Of course you don't, you've said so. But I don't believe you in any case, because you're someone who would embrace the devil for being a man without his match in the world." "Where's that quotation from?" "From the suppressed preface to the Robbers." Naturally from the suppressed preface, Ulrich thought. He wouldn't bother with the one read by everyone else. Minds that are drawn to the most loathsome vices for their aura of greatness. Arnheim continued to quote from his capacious memory. He felt himself to be the master of the situation once more, and that a middle dot Ulrich, for whatever reasons, had given ground. The antagonistic edge was gone, no need to bring up that offer again. What a narrow escape. But just as a wrestler knows when his opponent is slackening off and then gives it all he's got, so he felt he needed to let the full weight of his offer sink in, and said, "I believe you understand me better now. Quite frankly, there are times when I am keenly aware of being alone. The new men think too much in purely business terms, and those business families in their second or third generation tend to lose their imagination. They produce nothing but impeccable administrators and army officers, and they go in for castles, hunting parties, and title deeds sons-in-law. I know their kind the world over, fine, intelligent individuals among them, but incapable of coming up with a single idea concomitant with that basic state of restlessness, independence, and possibly unhappiness I referred to with my Schiller quotation just now." "I'm sorry I can't stay and talk more," Ulrich said. "Frau Tutsi is probably waiting in some friend's house for things a middle dot to quiet down out there, but I have to go now. So you suppose me capable, despite my ignorance of business, of that restlessness which is so good for business by making it so much less narrowly businesslike?" He had turned on the light in preparation for saying goodbye, and waited for an answer. With majestic camaraderie, Arnheim laid his arm on Ulrich's shoulder, a gesture that seemed to have proved its usefulness by now, and answered, "Do forgive me if I seem to have said rather too much, in a mood of loneliness. Business and finance are coming into power, and one sometimes asks oneself what to do with this power. I hope you won't take it amiss. On the contrary, Ulrich assured him. I mean to think your proposal over quite seriously. He said it in a rush, which could be interpreted as a sign of excitement. This left Arnheim, who was staying on to wait for Diotima, rather disconcerted and worried that it might not be too easy to FMD a face-saving way of making Ulrich forget the offer. 122. Going home. Ulrich decided to walk home. It was a fine night, though dark. The houses, tall and compact, formed a strange space street, open at the top to darkness, wind, and clouds. The road was deserted, as if the earlier unrest had left everything in a deep slumber. Whenever Ulrich did encounter a pedestrian, the sound of his footsteps had preceded him independently for a long time, like some weighty announcement. The night gave one a sense of impending events, as in a theatre. One had a notion of oneself as a phenomenon in this world, something that appears bigger than it is, that produces an echo, and, when it passes a middle dot lighted surfaces, is accompanied by its shadow like a huge spastic clown, rising to full height and the next moment creeping humbly to heel. How happy one can tell, he thought. He walked through a stone archway in the passage some 10 paces long, running parallel to the street and separated from it by heavy buttresses. Darkness slept from comers, ambush and sudden death flickered in the dim cloister. A fierce, ancient, grim joy seized the soul. Perhaps this was too much, Ulrich suddenly imagined with what smugness and inward self-dramatization Arnheim would be walking her in his place. It killed the pleasure in his shadow and echo, and the spooky music in the walls faded out. He knew that he would not accept Arnheim's a middle dot offer, but now he merely felt like a phantom stumbling through life's gallery, dismayed at being unable to find the body it should occupy, and was thoroughly relieved when before long he passed into a district less grand and less oppressive. Wide streets and squares opened out in the blackness, and the commonplace buildings, peacefully starred with lighted rows of windows, laid no further spell on him. Come into the open, he breathed this peace and remembered for no special reason some childhood photographs he had recently been looking at, pictures showing him with his mother, who had died young. From what a distance he had regarded the little boy, with a beautiful woman in an old-fashioned dress happily smiling at him. There was that overpowering impression of the good, affectionate, bright little boy they all felt him to be. There were hopes for him that were in no way his own. There were the vague expectations of a distinguished, promising future, like the outspread wings of a golden net opening to enfold him. And though all this had been invisible at the time, then it was for all to see decades afterward in those old photographs, and from the midst of this visible invisibility that could so easily have become reality, there was his tender, blank baby face looking back at him with the slightly forced expression of having to hold still. He had felt a trace of warmth for that little boy, and even if he did take some pride in his beautiful mother, he had on the whole the impressive 6N of having narrowly escaped a great horror. Anyone who has had the experience of seeing some earlier incarnation of himself gazing at him from an old photograph, wrapped in a bygone moment of self-satisfaction, as if glue had dried up or fallen out, will understand Ulrich's asking himself what sort of glue it was that seemed to hold for other people. He had now reached one of those green spaces bordered by trees, a break in the ring's terrace, which follows the line of the ancient city walls, and he might have crossed it in a few strides, but the broad strip of sky above the trees made him turn aside and follow where it was leading, seeming to come closer and closer to the festoons of lights so intent upon their privacy in the distant sky above that wintry park, without actually getting any nearer to them. It's a kind of foreshortening of the mind's perspective, he thought, that creates the tranquil sense of the evening, which, from one day to the next, gives one this firm sense of life being in full accord with itself. Happiness, after all, depends for the most part not on one's ability to resolve contradictions but on making them disappear, the way the gaps between trees disappear when we look down a long avenue of them. And just as the visual relationships of things always shift to make a coherent picture for the eye, one in which the immediate and near at hand looks big, while even the big things at a distance look small and the gaps close up and the scene as a whole ends by rounding itself out, so it is with the invisible connections which our minds and feelings unconsciously arrange for us in such a way that we are left to feel we are fully in charge of our affairs. And just this is what I don't seem to be able to achieve the way I should, he said to himself. A wide puddle blocked his way. Perhaps it was this puddle, or perhaps it was the bare, brunei-like trees on either side, that conjured up a country road and a village, and awakened in him that monotonous state of the soul halfway between fulfillment and futility which comes with life in the country, a life that had tempted him more than once to repeat the escape he had made as a young man. Everything becomes so simple, he felt. One's feelings get drowsy, one's thoughts drift off like clouds after bad weather, and suddenly a clear sky breaks out of the soul, and under that sky a cow in the middle of the path may begin a middle dot to blaze with meaning. Things come intensely alive as if there were nothing else in the world. A single cloud drifting past may transform the whole region. The grass darkens, then shines with wetness, nothing else has happened, and yet it's been like a voyage from one seashore to another. Or an old man loses his last tooth, and this trifling event may become a landmark in the lives of his neighbors, from which they date their memories. Every evening the birds sing around the village in the same way, in the stillness of the setting sun, but it feels like something a middle dot new happening every time, as though a middle dot the world were not yet 7 days old. In the country, he thought, the gods still come to people. A man matters, his experiences matter, but in the city, where experiences come by the thousands, we can no longer relate them to ourselves, and this is of course the beginning of life's notorious turning into abstraction. But even as he thought all this, he was also aware of how this abstraction extended a man's powers 1,000-fold and how, even if from the point of view of any given detail it diluted him 10-fold, as a whole it expanded him 100-fold, and there could be no question of turning the wheel backward. And in one of those apparently random and abstract thoughts that so often assumed importance in his life, it struck him that when one is overburdened and dreams of simplifying one's life, the basic law of this life, the law one longs for, is nothing other than that of narrative order, the simple order that enables one to say, first this happened and then that happened. It is the simple sequence of events in which the overwhelmingly manifold nature of things is represented in a unidimensional order, as a mathematician would say, stringing all that has occurred in space and time on a single thread, which calms us, that celebrated thread of the story, which is, it seems, the thread of life itself. Lucky the man who can say when, before, and after terrible things may have happened to him, he may have writhed in pain, but as soon as he can tell what happened in chronological order, he feels as contented as if the sun were warming his belly. This is the trick the novel artificially turns to account. Whether the wanderer is riding on the highway in pouring rain or crunching through snow and ice at 10 below zero, the reader feels a cozy glow, and this would be hard to understand if this eternally dependable narrative device, which even nursemaids can rely on to keep their little charges quiet, this tried and true foreshortening of the mind's perspective, were not already part and parcel of life itself. Most people relate to themselves as storytellers. They usually have no use for poems, and although the occasional because or in order that gets knotted into the thread of life, they generally detest any brooding that goes beyond that. They love the orderly sequence of facts because it has a middle dot, the look of necessity, and the impression that their life has a course is somehow their refuge from chaos. It now came to Ulrich that he had lost this elementary, narrative mode of thought to which private life still clings, even though everything in public life has already ceased to be narrative and no longer follows a thread, but instead spreads out as an infinitely interwoven surface. When he resumed his homeward progress, reflecting on this insight, he remembered Goethe writing in an essay on art that man is not a teaching animal but one that lives, acts, and influences. He respectfully shrugged his shoulders. These days, he thought, a man can only allow himself to forget the uncertainties on which he must base his life and his actions as much as an actor who forgets the scenery and his makeup, and believes that he is really living his part. The thought of Goethe, however, brought back the thought of Arnheim, who was always misusing Goethe as an authority, and Ulrich suddenly remembered with distaste his extraordinary confusion when Arnheim had placed an arm on his shoulder. At this point he had emerged from under the trees and was back on the street, looking for the best way home. Peering upward for a street sign, he almost ran full tilt into a shadowy figure emerging from the darkness, and had to pull up short to avoid knocking down the prostitute who had stepped in his way. She held her ground and smiled instead of revealing her annoyance at his having charged into her like a bull, and Ulrich suddenly felt that her professional smile somehow created a little aura of warmth in the night. She spoke to him, using the threadbare words commonly thrown out as bait, which are like the dirty leavings of other men. She had a child's sloping shoulders, blonde hair was showing under her hat, and her face looked pale, even ineffably appealing under the lamplight. Beneath her nighttime makeup there was the suggestion of a young girl's freckled skin. She was much shorter than Ulrich and had to look up into his face, yet she said baby to him again, too numb to see anything out of place in this sound she uttered hundreds of times in a night. Ulrich found it touching somehow. He did not brush her off but stopped and let her repeat her offer, as though he had not understood. Here he had unexpectedly found a friend who, for a slight charge, would put herself entirely at his disposal, ready to do her best to please him and avoid anything to put him off. If he showed himself willing, she would slip her arm in his with a gentle trustfulness and faint hesitation, as when old friends meet again for the FRRST time after a separation not of their own making. If he promised to double or a middle dot treble her usual price, and put the money on a table beforehand, so that she need not think about it but could abandon herself to that carefree, obliging state of mind that goes with having made a good deal, it would be shown a middle dot that pure indifference has the merit of all pure feeling, which is without personal presumption and functions minus the needless confusion caused by interference from private emotions. Such thoughts went through his mind, half seriously, half flippantly, and he could not bring himself altogether to disappoint the little person, who was waiting for him to strike a deal. He even realized that he wanted her to like him, but clumsily enough, instead of simply exchanging a few words with her in the language of her profession, he fumbled in his pocket, slipped approximately the amount she would have asked into her hand, and walked on. For the space of a moment he had briefly pressed her hand which had oddly resisted, in a middle dot her surprise firmly in his, with a single friendly word. But as he left this willing volunteer behind, he knew that she would rejoin her colleagues, who were whispering nearby in the dark, show them the money, and finally think of some jibe at him to give vent to feelings she could not understand. The encounter lived on in his mind for a while as though it had been a tender riddle of a minute's duration. He did not romanticize the poverty of his fleeting friend or her debasement, But when he imagined how she would have turned up her eyes and given the fake little moan she had learned to deliver at the right moment, he couldn't help feeling without knowing why that there was something touching about this deeply vulgar, hopelessly inept private performance for an agreed price, perhaps because it was a burlesque version of the human comedy itself. Even while he was still speaking to the girl he had thought fleetingly of Musil, the pathological comedian, the pursuer and nemesis of prostitutes, who had been out walking on that other, unlucky night just as Ulrich was this evening. When the house fronts on that street had stopped swaying like stage scenery for a moment, Musil had bumped into the unknown creature who had awaited him by the bridge the night of the murder. What a shock of recognition it must have been, going through him from head to toe. For an instant, Ulrich thought he could feel it himself. Something was lifting him off the ground like a wave. He lost his balance but didn't need it, the movement itself carried him along. His heart contracted, but his imaginings became confused and overran all bounds, until they dissolved in an almost enervating voluptuousness. He made an effort to calm down. He had apparently been living so long without some central purpose that he was actually envying a psychopath his obsessions and his faith in the part he was playing. But Musil was fascinating, after all, not just to himself but to everyone else as well. Ulrich heard a mime's voice asking him, would you set him free? And his own answer, no. Probably not. Never ever, he now said to himself, and yet he had a hallucinatory image of an act in which the movement of reaching out in some extreme state of excitement and that of being moved by it fused into an ineffable communion, in which desire was indistinguishable from compulsion, meaning from necessity, and the most intense activity from blissful receptiveness. He fleetingly recalled the opinion that SMH luckless creatures as Musil were the embodiments of repressed instincts common to all, of all the murders and rapes committed in fantasies. Let those who believed this make their own peace with Musil, let them justify him to re-establish their own morality, after they had satisfied their dark urges through him. Ulrich's conflict was different. He repressed nothing and could not help seeing that the image of a murderer was no stranger to him than any other of the world's pictures. What they all had in common with H.L.'s old images of himself, part crystallization of meaning, part resurgence of the nonsense beneath. An impotent metaphor of order, that was what Musil meant for him. And suddenly Ulrich said, all of that and made a gesture as though thrusting something aside with the back of his hand. He had not merely thought it, he had said it out loud, and reacted to hearing himself speak by pressing his lips together and finishing his statement in silence. All of that has to be settled, once and for all. I never mind what all of that was in detail, it was everything he had been preoccupied with, tormented by, sometimes even delighted with, ever since he had taken his sabbatical. Everything that had tied him up in knots, like a dreamer for whom all things are possible except getting up and moving about, all that had led him from one impossible thing to another, from TP.E very beginning until these last minutes of his homeward walk. Ulrich felt that he would now at long last have to either live like everybody else, for some attainable goal, or come to grips with one of his impossible possibilities. He had reached his own neighborhood, and he quickened his pace through the last street with a peculiar sense of hovering on some threshold. The feeling lent him wings, it moved him to take action, but as it was unspecific, again he was left with only an incomparable sense of freedom. This might have passed off like so much else. But when he turned a comer into his own street he thought he saw all the windows of his house lit up, and shortly afterward, when he reached his garden gate, he could have no doubt about it. His old servant had asked for permission to spend the night with relatives somewhere. Ulrich had not been home since the episode with Gerda, when it was still daylight, and the gardener couple, who lived on the ground floor, never entered his rooms, yet there were lights on everywhere. Intruders must be in the house, burglars he was about to take by surprise. Ulrich was so bewildered, and so disinclined to shake off the spell he was under, that he walked straight up to the house without hesitation. He had no idea what to expect. He saw shadows on the windows that seemed to indicate there was only one person moving about inside, but there could be more, and he wondered whether he might be walking into a bullet as he entered, or should he be prepared to shoot first. In a different state of mind Ulrich would probably have gone looking for a policeman or at least investigated the situation before deciding what to do, but he wanted this adventure to himself, and did not even reach for the pistol he sometimes carried since the night he had been knocked down by the hoodlums. He didn't know what he wanted, he was willing to see what happened. But when he pushed open the front door and entered the house, the burglar he had been looking forward to with such mixed feelings was only Clarisse. 123. The turning point. Ulrich's recklessness might from the beginning have been motivated in part by an underlying faith in some harmless explanation for everything. That shying away from believing the worst that always leads one into danger. Nevertheless, when his old servant unexpectedly came up to him in the hall, he almost knocked him down. Fortunately, he stopped himself in time, and was told that a telegram had come, which Clarisse had signed for and was now holding for him upstairs. The young lady had arrived about an hour ago, just as he, the old man, had been about to leave, and she would not let herself be turned away, so that he had preferred to stay in and give up his night out this once, for if he might be permitted to say so, the young lady seemed to be rather upset. Ulrich thanked him and went up to his rooms, where he found Clarisse lying on the couch, on her side with her legs drawn up. Her straight, slim figure, her boyish haircut, and the charming oval of her face resting on one hand as she looked at him when he opened the door all made a most seductive picture. He told her that he had taken her for a burglar. Clarisse's eyes flashed like rapid bursts of machine gun fire. Maybe I am a burglar, she said. That old fox your servant did his best to make me leave. I sent him off to bed, but I know he's been lurking out of sight downstairs somewhere. Your house is lovely. She held out the telegram to him without getting up. I was curious to see what you're like when you come home to be by yourself, she went on. Walter's gone to a concert. He won't be back till after midnight. But I didn't tell him I was coming to see you. Ulrich ripped open the telegram and read it while only half listening to Clarisse's words. He turned suddenly pale and read the startling message over again, unable to take it in. Although he had failed to answer several letters from his father asking him about the progress of the parallel campaign and the problem of diminished responsibility, a longish interval had passed, without his noticing it, since any further reminders had come, and now this telegram, obviously drafted in advance with meticulous care by his father himself, informed him punctiliously, and in a funereal one that did not quite succeed in repressing all reproach, of his own death. There had been little enough affection between them. In fact, the thought of his father had almost always been rather disturbing to Ulrich, and yet, as he now read the quaintly sinister text over again, he was thinking, now I am all alone in the world. He did not mean it literally, nor would that have made any sense, considering how things had been between them. What he meant was that he felt, with some amazement, that he was floating free, as though some mooring rope had snapped, or that his state of alienation from a world to which his father had been the last link had now become complete and final. My father's dead, he said to Clarisse, holding up the telegram with a touch of unintended solemnity. Oh. Clarisse said. Congratulations. And after a slight, thoughtful pause she added, I suppose, you're going to be very rich now? And looked around with interest. I don't believe he was more than moderately well off, Ulrich replied distantly. He'd been living here quite beyond his means. Clarisse acknowledged the rebuke with a tiny smile, a sort of little curtsy of a smile. Many of her expressive movements were as abrupt and disproportionate in a small space as the theatrical bow of a boy who must demonstrate before company how well he has been brought up. She was left alone, for a few moments while Ulrich excused himself to go and make preparations for the trip he would have to take. When she had left Walter after their violent scene she had not gone far. Outside the door to their apartment there was a seldom used staircase leading up to the attic, and there she had sat, wrapped in a shawl, until she heard him leave the house. It made her think of the lofts in theatres for the stage machinery, where ropes run on pulleys, and there she sat while Walter made his exit down the stairs. She imagined that actresses might sit on the rafters above the stage between calls, wrapped in shawls, watching the stage from above, enjoying a full view of everything that was going on, just as she was now. It fitted in with a favourite notion of hers, that life was a dramatic role to be played. There was no need to understudy one's part rationally, she thought. After all, what did anyone know about it, even those who might know more than she did? It was a matter of having the right instinct for life, like a storm bird. One simply spread out one's arms, and for her that included words, tears, kisses like wings, and took off. This fantasy offered some compensation to her for being no longer able to believe in Walter's future. She looked down the steep staircase Walter had just descended, spread her arms, and kept them raised in that position as long as she could. Perhaps she could help him in that way. A steep ascent and a steep descent are strong complementary opposites and belong together, she thought. Joyful world aslant was what she named her wing-spread arms and her gaze down the stairwell. She changed her mind about sneaking out to watch the demonstrators in town. What did she care about the common herd? The fantastic drama of the elect had begun. And so Clarisse had gone to see Ulrich. On the way a sly smile would sometimes appear on her face, whenever it occurred to her that Walter thought her crazy each time she let slip any sign of her greater insight into what was going on between them. It tickled her vanity to know that he was afraid of having a child by her even while he impatiently longed for it. Crazy to her meant being something like summer lightning, or enjoying so extraordinary a degree of health that it frightened people. It was a quality her marriage had brought out in her, step by step, as her feelings of superiority and control grew. She did realize, all the same, that there were times when other people did not know what to make of her, and when Ulrich reappeared she felt she ought to say something to him that would be in keeping with an event that cut so deeply into his life. She leapt up from the couch, paced through the room and the adjoining rooms, and then said, "Well, my sincere condolences, old fellow." Ulrich looked at her in astonishment, although he recognized the tone she fell into when she was nervous. Sometimes she's so hopelessly conventional, he thought. It's like coming upon a page from another book bound in with what one is reading. She had not bothered to watch her words with the appropriate expression but had flung them at him sideways, over her shoulder, which heightened the effect of hearing, not a false note exactly, but the wrong words to the tune, giving the uncanny impression that she herself consisted of many such misplaced texts. When she received no answer from Ulrich, she stopped in front of him and said, "I have to talk with you. May I offer you some refreshment?" Ulrich said. Clarisse only fluttered her hand at shoulder height to signal no. She pulled her thoughts together and said, "Walter is dead set on having a child. Can you understand that?" She seemed to be waiting for an answer. But what could Ulrich have said to that? "But I don't want to," she cried out violently. "Well, no need to fly into a rage," Ulrich said. "If you don't want to, it can't happen. But it's destroying him. People who are always expecting to die generally live a long time. You and I will be shriveled ancients while Walter will still have his boyish face under his white mane as director of his archives. Clarisse turned pensively on her heel and walked away from Ulrich. At a distance, she wheeled to face him again and fixed him with her eye. Have you ever seen an umbrella with its shaft removed? Walter falls apart when I come away from him. I'm his shaft and he's... She was about to say my umbrella but thought of something much better. My shield, she said. He sees himself as my protector. And the first thing that means is giving me a big belly. Next will be the lectures on breastfeeding the infant because that is nature's way, and then he'll want to bring up the child in his own image. You know him well enough to know all that. All he wants is to have the rights to everything and a terrific excuse for making bourgeois conformists out of both of us. But if I go on saying no, as I have been, he'll be done for. I mean simply everything to him. Ulrich smiled incredulously at this sweeping claim. He wants to kill you, Clarisse added quickly. What? I thought that was your suggestion to him. I want the child from you, Clarisse said. Ulrich whistled through his teeth in surprise. She smiled like an adolescent who has misbehaved with deliberate provocation. I wouldn't do something so underhanded to such an old friend, Ulrich said slowly. It goes against my grain. A middle dot oh? So you're a man of high scruple, are you? Clarisse seemed to attach some special significance of her own to this that Ulrich didn't understand. She gave it some thought and then redued to the attack. But if you are my lover, he's got you where he wants you. How do you mean? It's obvious, I just don't know quite how to put it. You'll be forced to treat him with consideration. We'll both be feeling sorry for him. You can't just go ahead and cheat on him, of course, so you'll have to try to make it up to him somehow. And so on and so forth. And most important of all, you'll be driving him to bring out the best that's in him. You know perfectly well that we're stuck inside ourselves like statues in a block of stone. We have to sculpt our way out. We have to force each other to do it. Maybe so, Ulrich said. But aren't you getting ahead of yourself? What makes you think any of this will happen? Clarisse was smiling again. Perhaps I am ahead of myself, she said. She sidled up to him and slipped her arm confidingly under his, which hung limply at his side and made no room for hers. Don't you find me attractive? Don't you like me? She asked. And when he did not answer, she went on, but you do find me attractive, I know it, I've seen it often enough, the way you look at me, when you come to see us. Do you remember if I've ever told you that you're the devil? That's how I feel. Try to understand, I'm not calling you a poor devil, that's the kind who wants to do evil because he doesn't know any better. You are a great devil, you know what's good and you do the opposite of what you'd like to do. You know the life we lead is abominable, and so you say mockingly that we must go on with it. And you say, full of your high scruples, I won't cheat on a friend, but you only say that because you've thought 100 times, I'd like to have Clarisse. But just because you're a devil you have something of a god inside you, hello. A great god. The kind who lies to try to keep from being recognized. You do want me. She had gripped both his arms now, standing before him with her face lifted up to his, her body curving back like a plant responding to a touch on its petals. In a moment her face will be drenched with it. Look, like the last time, Ulrich thought apprehensively. But nothing of the kind happened, her face remained beautiful. Instead of her usual tight smile there was an open one, which showed a little of her teeth between the rosy flesh of her lips, as though about to bite. Her mouth took on the shape of a double cupid's bow, a line echoed in the curve of her eyebrows and again in the translucent cloud of her hair. A middle dot. For a long time now you've been wanting to pick me up with those teeth in that lying mouth of yours and carry me off. If only you could stand to let me see you as you really are, Clarisse had continued. Ulrich gently freed himself from her grip. She dropped down on the couch as if he had put her there, and pulled him down after her. You really shouldn't let your imagination run away with you like this, Ulrich said in reproof. A middle dot. Clarisse had let go of him. She closed her eyes and supported her head with both hands, her elbows resting on her knees. Now that her second attack had been repelled, she decided to resort to icy logic. Don't be so literal-minded, she said. When I speak of the devil, or of God, it's only a figure of speech. But when I'm alone at home, or walking in the neighborhood, I often think, if I turn to the left, God will come, if I turn to the right, the devil. Or when I'm about to pick something up with my hand, I have the same feeling about choosing the right or the left hand. When I tell Walter about it he puts his hands in his pockets, in real panic. He's happy to see a flower in bloom, or even a snail, but don't you think the life we lead is terribly a middle dot sad? No God comes, or the devil either. I've been waiting for years now, but what is there to wait for? Nothing. That's all there is, unless art can work a miracle and change everything. At this moment there was something so gentle and sad about her that Ulrich gave way to an impulse to touch her soft hair with /nature's hand. You may be right in the details, Clarisse, he said. But I can never follow your leaps from one point to another, or see how it all hangs together. It's quite simple, she said, still in the same posture as before. As time went on, an idea came to me. Listen. She straightened up and was suddenly quite vivacious again. Didn't you once say yourself that the way we live is full of cracks through which we can see the impossible state of affairs underneath, as it were? You needn't say anything, I've known all about it for a long time. We all want to have our lives in order, but nobody has. I play the piano or paint a picture, but it's like putting up a screen to hide a hole in the wall. You and Walter also have ideas, and I don't understand much of that. But that doesn't work either, and you said yourself that we avoid looking at the whole out of habit or laziness, or else we let ourselves be distracted from it by bad things. Well, there's a simple answer, that's the hole we have to escape through. And I know how? There are days when I can slip out of myself. Then it's like finding yourself, how shall I put it? Right in the center of things as if peeled out of a shell, and the things have had their dirty riddy peeled off too. Or else one feels connected by the air with everything there is, like a Siamese twin. It's an incredible, marvelous feeling, everything turns into music and color and rhythm, and I'm no longer the citizen Clarisse, as I was baptized, but perhaps a shining splinter pressing into some immense unfathomable happiness. But you know all about that. That's what you meant when you said that there's something impossible about reality, and that one's experiences should not be turned inward, as something personal and real, but must be turned outward, like a song or a painting, and so on and so forth. Oh, I could recite it all exactly the way you said it. Her so on and so forth recurred like some wild refrain as Clarisse's torrent of words flowed on, regularly interspersed with her assertion you can do it, but you won't, and I don't know why you won't, but I'm going to shake you up. Ulrich had let her go on talking, only shaking his head from time to time when she attributed to him something too unlikely, but he could not bring himself to argue with her and left his hand resting on her hair, where his fingertips could almost sense the confused pulsation of the thoughts inside her skull. He had never yet seen Clarisse in such a state of sensual excitement and was amazed to see that even in her slim, hard young body there was room for all the loosening and soft expansion of a woman's glowing passion. This sudden, always surprising opening up of a woman one has known only as inaccessibly shut away in herself did not fail to have its effect on him. Although they defied all reason, her words did not repel him. For as they came close to touching him in the quick and then again angled off into absurdity, their constant rapid movement, like a buzzing or humming, drowned out the quality of the tone, beautiful or ugly, in the intensity of the vibrations. Listening to her seemed to help him make up his mind, like some wild music, and it was only when she seemed to have lost her way in the maze of her own words and could not find her way out that he shook her head a little with his outspread hand, as though to call her back and set her straight. But the opposite of what he intended happened, for Clarisse suddenly made a physical assault on him. She flung an arm around his neck and pressed her lips to his so quickly that it took him completely by surprise and he had no time to resist, as she pulled her legs up under her body and slid over to him so that she ended up kneeling in his lap. He could feel the little hardball 9F1 breast pressing against his shoulder. He caught barely anything of what she was saying. She stammered something about her power of redemption, his cowardice, and his being a barbarian, which was why she wanted to conceive the Redeemer of the world from him and not from Walter. Actually, her words were no more than a raving murmur at his ear, a hasty muttering under her breath more concerned with itself than with communication, a rippling stream of sound in which he could only catch a word here and there, such as moo's brugger or devil's eye. In self-defense he had grabbed his little assailant by her upper arms and pushed her back on a couch, so that she was now struggling against him with her legs, pushing her hair into his face and trying to get her arms around his neck again. "I'll kill you if you don't give in," she said loud and clear. Like a boy fighting in affection mixed with anger, who won't be put off, she struggled on in mounting excitement. The effort of restraining her left him with only a faint sense of the current of desire streaming through her body. Even so, Ulrich had been strongly affected by it at the moment of putting his arm firmly around her and pressing her down. It was as if her body had penetrated his senses. He had after all known her for such a long time, and had often indulged in a bit of horseplay with her, but he had never been in such close, head-to-toe contact with this little creature, so familiar and yet so strange, its heart wildly bouncing. And when Clarisse's movements quieted down in the grip of his hands, and the relaxation of her muscles was reflected tenderly in the glow of her eyes, what he did not want to happen almost happened. But at this instant he thought of Gerda, as though it were only NMV that he was facing the challenge to come to terms with himself. "I don't want to, Clarisse," he said, and let her go. "I need to be by myself now, and I have things to do before I leave." When Clarisse grasped his refusal, it was as though with a jolt her head had shifted gears. She saw Ulrich standing a few steps away, his face contorted with embarrassment, saw him saying things she did not seem to take in, but as she watched the movement of his lips she felt a growing revulsion. Then she noticed that her skirt was above her knees, and jumped up off the couch. Before she understood what had happened, she was on her feet, shaking her hair and her clothes into place, as if she had been lying on the grass, and said, "Of course you have to pack now, I won't keep you any longer." She was smiling again, her normal vaguely scoffing smile that was forced through a narrow slit, and wished him a good trip. "By the time you're back we'll probably have May and Gust staying with us. He wrote to say he was coming, and that's actually what I came to tell you," she added casually. Ulrich hesitantly held her hand. She was rubbing his playfully with a finger. She would have given anything to know what in the world she had been saying to him. She must have said all sorts of things, because she had been so worked up that now she had forgotten it all. She did have a general idea of what had happened, and she didn't mind, for her feelings told her that she had been brave already to sacrifice herself, and Ulrich timid. She wanted only to part as good friends and not to leave him in any doubt about that. Better not tell Walter about this visit, and keep what we were talking about between ourselves for the time being, she said lightly. She gave him her hand once more at the garden gate and declined his offer to accompany her beyond it. When Ulrich went back into the house he was preoccupied. He had to write some letters to let Count Lonsdorff and Dieter know he was leaving and had to attend to various other details, because he foresaw that taking over his inheritance might keep him away for some time. He stuffed various personal articles and a few books into the traveling cases already packed by his servant, whom he had sent off to bed, but when he had finished he no longer felt like going to bed himself. He was both exhausted and overstimulated after his eventful day, yet instead of cancelling each other out, these two states of feeling only heightened each other so that, tired as he was, he felt unable to sleep. Not really thinking, but following the oscillations of his memories, Ulrich began by acknowledging that he could no longer doubt his impression, at various times, that Clarisse was not merely an unusual person but probably already mentally unbalanced, and yet, during her attack just now, or whatever one might call it, she had said things that were too close for comfort to much that he had occasionally said himself. This should have started him really thinking hard, but it only brought the unwelcome reminder, in his half-drowsy state, that he still had much to do. Almost half of the year he had taken off to think was gone, without his having settled any of his problems. It flashed through his mind that Gerda had urged him to write a book about it. But he wanted to live without splitting himself into a real and a shadow self. He remembered speaking to Section Chief Tutsi about writing. He saw himself and Tutsi standing in Dia Turner's drawing room, and there was something theatrical, something stagey, about the scene. He remembered saying casually that he would probably have to either write a book or kill himself. But the thought of death, thinking it over at close range, so to speak, did not in the least correspond to his present state of mind either. When he explored it a little and toyed with the notion of killing himself before morning instead of taking the train, it struck him as an improper conjunction at the moment he had received the news of his father's death. Half asleep as he was, the figures of his imagination raced through his mind. He saw himself peering down the dark barrel of a gun, where he saw a shadowy nothing, the darkness veiling the depths beyond, and mused on the rare coincidence that the same image of a loaded gun had been his favorite metaphor in his youth, when his will was all charged up, waiting to take aim and let fly at some unknown target. His mind was flooded with images such as the pistol and standing with Tutsi. The look of a meadow in the early morning. A winding river valley filled with dense evening mists, as seen from a moving train. The place at the far end of Europe where he had parted from the woman he loved. He had forgotten what she looked like, but the image of the unpaved village streets and the thatched cottages was as fresh as yesterday. The hair under the arm of another loved woman, all that was left of her. Snatches of forgotten melodies. A characteristic movement. The fragrance of flower beds, unnoticed at the time because of the charged words being forced out by the profound emotion of two souls, and coming back to him now when the words and the people were long forgotten. He saw a man on various paths, almost painful to look at, left over like a row of puppets that had their springs broken long ago. One would think that such images are the most transient things in the world, but there are moments when all one's life splits up into such images, solitary relics along the road of life, as though the road led only away from them and back to them again, as though a man's fate were obeying not his ideas and his will but these mysterious, half-meaningless pictures. But while he was moved almost to tears by the pointlessness, the uselessness, of all the efforts he had ever taken pride in, his sleepless, exhausted state gave rise to a feeling, or perhaps one should say that a marvelous feeling diffused itself around him. The lights Clarisse had turned on in all the rooms while she was alone were still on, and an excess of light flowed back and forth between the walls and the objects, filling the space between with an almost living presence. It was probably the tenderness inherent in any painless state of exhaustion that changed his total sense of his body. This ever-present though unheeded physical self-awareness, vaguely enough defined in any case, now passed over into a more yielding and expansive state. It was a loosening up as though a tourniquet were coming undone, and since neither the walls nor the objects underwent any real change and no God entered the rooms of this unbeliever, and since Ulrich himself by no means allowed his clear judgment to become clouded, unless his fatigue deceived him into thinking so, it could only be the relationship between himself and his surroundings that was undergoing such a change. That transformation was not objective, it was a subjective expanse of feeling, deep as groundwater, on which the senses and the intelligence, those pillars of objective perception, normally supported themselves but which they now were gently separating or merging. The distinction lost its meaning almost as soon as he made it. It's a change in attitude. As I change, everything else involved changes too, Ulrich thought, sure that he had himself well under observation. But one could also say that his solitude, a condition that was present within him as well as around him, binding both his worlds, it could be said, and he felt it himself, that this solitude was growing greater or denser all the time. It flowed through the walls, flooded the city, then, without actually expanding, inundated the world. What world? He thought. There is none. The notion no longer seemed to have any meaning. But Ulrich's good judgment was still sufficiently in charge to make him recoil at once from such an exaggeration. He stopped hunting for more words and moved instead toward a state of full wakefulness. After a few seconds he gave a start. Day was breaking. Its grey pallor mingling with the swiftly withering brightness of the artificial light. Ulrich jumped to his feet and stretched. Something remained in his body that he could not shake off. He passed a finger over his eyelids, but something remained of that gentleness, that fusion of his vision and the things it beheld. And suddenly he recognized in a way hard to describe a sort of tining away of his strength, as though he had lost any power to go on denying that he was again standing exactly where he had stood years before. He shook his head, smiling. An attack of the Major's wife, he called it mockingly. There was no real danger of that, his rational mind told him, since there was no one with whom he could have repeated that old foolishness. He opened a window. The air outside was neutral, ordinary everyday morning air in which the first sounds of the city's life were a middle dot striking up. He let its coolness rinse his temples, as the civilized European's distaste for sentimentality began to fill him with its hard clarity, and he made up his mind to deal with the situation, if necessary, with the utmost precision. And yet, standing for a long time at the window, staring out into the morning without thinking of anything, he still had a sense of all the feelings that were slipping gleamingly away. His servant's sudden entrance, with the solemn expression of the early riser, to wake him up, took Ulrich by surprise. He took a bath, rapidly did a few vigorous exercises, and left for the railroad station.